Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Fanfiction podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. Today, we're diving into a brand new story, The Last of His Kind Part 4. Before we jump in, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Chapter Notes. Chapter 10. So it's been a while, hasn't it? Not too long, but longer than previous updates. Unfortunately, that will probably continue to be the case for the next few months, as I'm a frontline medical worker at the NHS in the UK, and so am naturally quite a lot busier than I usually am, and can only find so many hours in my week to write at the moment, especially with everything that's going on. That said, let's see what happens in the future. For now, I will continue to write in my downtime and update my stories as and when I can. All I can ask, though, is that you be patient, as sometimes I'm not in the mood to write, whilst others times I am. Thanks a lot for understanding, if you do, and thanks for your continued support. I hope you enjoy reading this chapter, and leave a review if you can. Disclaimer, I do not own the Elder Scrolls or Danmachi. Last time. Are we heading back now? Welf asked. Yeah, I think I've seen enough for now. Plus we picked up enough soul gems and materials for the moment. Azoth nodded, the mage light following him as he led the way back to the surface, Welf, now weighed down by a heavy bag, walking along behind him. That, and I want to check out this monstophilia thing. It's overrated. Welf grunted. Maybe, but I'd like to check it out all the same. Azoth shot back, the two of them, quickly heading up through the dungeon and back to the surface. It had been a pretty successful trip into the dungeon today, all things considered. See the end of the chapter for more. Notes. At the guild building. So, a successful day in the dungeon then. Aina said mildly, her green eyes panning from the awkward-looking Welf Crozo to his grinning, white-haired, elven companion, Azoth. The unlikely pair, thankfully, or at least in her mind, attracting little in the way of attention from the average passerby and guild building user as they unloaded their packs of crystals and started to deposit them on two waiting trays so that they could be exchanged for Valis. Yeah, I'd say it was quite successful, or at least for the most part. Yes, Azoth nodded, glancing up from his crystal-stuffed bag as he placed the last of the small crystals he was handing over on the tray in front of him. Welf here showed me around the dungeon, or at least the upper levels, and we ran into a few monsters too, enough for at least a good warm-up, even if they weren't all that tough to deal with. A good warm-up, he says. Welf chipped in, rolling his eyes as he just appended his own bag of crystals into the tray, creating a small mound of haphazardly placed crystals of varying size and quality. Yeah, sure, maybe if you're a level 6. For me, though, that was bloody stressful. Azoth sent the redhead a sideways smile in response to his comment, the taller, broader man, exuding the general cockiness and casual power that most adventurers of his ilk, or at least, from Aina's perspective, gave off. Picking up one of the larger crystals from Welf's tray, the size of which suggested its origin as being from one of the stronger monsters that lurked between floors 9 and 10, Aina's gaze went from Azoth's still bulging bag as he swung it over his shoulder to the marginally smaller pile of crystals in his tray. Aren't you going to cash them all in, Azoth? No, I'm keeping some of the larger, choice ones for myself, Azoth grinned, settling his bag comfortably at his side as he did so, before then meeting Aina's green eyes with his violet ones. Those monster soul gems, and some of the other drops, should be quite useful to experiment with, or at least they will prove useful to play around with once I get access to a forge. Aina hummed, pushing to one side the white-haired elf's odd terminology and odd ideas, as she instead idly inspected the lightly armored adventurer, her gaze trailing over the numerous nicks and scrapes on the silver armor he was wearing. I've never heard of monster crystals being used in that manner before, but still, you earned them, so you can choose what you want to do with them. Though honestly, I'd advise that you just cash them in. But again, the choice to do that is up to you, and not me. Absolutely. Azoth grinned heartily, flashing her his teeth as he saw the bemusement in her gaze. He could already guess that the half-elf thought him at least a little bit odd and eccentric. Still, that didn't bother him. After all, where was the fun in being normal? He had been part of the rank and file before, just another petty thief in a large guild of thieves, and just another bandit in a moderately sized band of bandits. It wasn't fun being a non-entity, and made you little more than an expendable asset. Someone that was always looked over and dismissed. Being normal and average was shit. Sure, it was better than being subpar or being seen as incompetent, but not by much. No, his life had certainly improved for the better, discounting the increased amount of danger and tribulation he had ended up enduring during his adventures, ever since he had found out that he was Dovahkian, Dragonborn. Yes, people who stood out from the crowd, for better or worse, and those who put themselves out there and went on dangerous quests and adventures, they prospered. High risk, but equally high reward, as they say. Or at least that was the way he saw things. He enjoyed standing out, and enjoyed fighting and adventuring and playing around in the forge, but more than that he enjoyed the rewards, perks, and adulation that came with standing out. I hope you were at least being careful down there in the dungeon. Aina pressed on, a frown on her face now as she waved away Azoth's cocky words. The elf was a level 6 adventurer, and thus was one of the most powerful people in the city, if not in the world. He was not the one she was concerned about. Welf is only a level 1, and shouldn't be going down too deep, not even if he is with you. To be fair, we didn't go that deep. We turned back and headed back up to the surface after exploring the 11th floor for a bit. Welf hurriedly said, a crooked smile on his face as he looked between the nonchalant Azoth and the noticeably concerned Aina. As Azoth said it, really wasn't that dangerous. If you say so, Aina muttered, sending the two of them another sharp, reprimanding look. Her eyes resting on Azoth for a moment or so longer, as if reprimanding the newbie level 6 adventurer for being irresponsible on his first run into the dungeon, and taking the experienced level 1 adventurer too deep. Honestly, Azoth mused to himself as he smiled back cheekily at Aina, the other elf, probably, like his own familiar and goddess, must be struggling to quantify him as a new adventurer, when he was clearly anything but, even if today was his first dive into the dungeon. Here are your valis, at the standard exchange rate, one of Aina's fellow guild workers said, as they brought over both Welf and Azoth's tray, within which Azoth could now see a small pile of coins, valis, the local currency, waiting for them. Thank you, Aina said primly, sending her associate a quick smile before she pushed the two trays across the desk and over to the two of them, after which she gestured for them to take their rewards. Sweeping the multitude of different-sized coins into his coin pouch, Azoth sent Aina one more quick smile. So Aina, what do you have on for the rest of the day? Work, Aina replied promptly, looking over her glasses at him. I have to wait for one of my other adventurers to come back from the dungeon. Aina paused after saying this, and then let out a sigh. And this adventurer's is one of my most frustrating ones. Or, I thought I had that positin. Azoth laughed. Oh, you're irritating too, but you at least are a level 6. I would at least think that you can look after yourself regardless of what trouble you find yourself in. My other adventurer. He's only a level 1, and seems to attract trouble like nothing else, and a lot of it. Aina sighed, massaging the bridge of her nose, and not even blinking at her blunt assessment of Azoth. In response, Azoth smiled. The half-elf had clearly gotten the measure of him already, and consequently knew that he didn't particularly care for formality, nor was he that easily offended. Oh my, I don't think that I've ever been so offended before. Azoth grinned, leaning against the counter now, and ignoring the blatant sigh of frustration from behind him and the way the redhead smith started to impatiently drum his fingers on the counter in boredom. Aina raised a single eyebrow at his comment, and then gave him an unimpressed look. Then, you need to get out more. Chuckling at her quick comeback, Azoth prepared to continue their banter, mainly because Aina was quite pleasant to converse with, though admittedly, a part of him was deriving a slight amount of satisfaction from Welf's rude and obvious displays of irritation and impatience. Honestly, a part of him wanted to see how far the redhead's patience could be pushed, as Welf, he noticed, despite being quite affable and friendly, was still keeping him at a deliberate distance. Admittedly, that was most likely because they had only known each other for 2 days, and he had thus not been able to worm his way past the younger man's walls yet. Unfortunately, before he was able to continue his bantering, he was distracted by a familiar, white-haired figure bursting into the guild and running over to their position, his entrance attracting a lot of attention as other adventurers and members of staff looked away from what they were doing and instead over at the haggard, battered-looking teen as he sprinting over to where Azoth, Welf, and Aina were currently stood. Frowning at the sight of the familiar white-haired, red-eyed kid, Azoth pushed away from the counter, his mind already whirling as he tried to remember the kid's name. He was the kid from the tavern, the only one in Hestia's familiar. Bell Cranel. "Hey, oh Mr. Azoth," Bell said, the white-haired teen almost falling over at the sight of him. Apparently he had been so focused on Aina that he hadn't even noticed the white-haired elf currently talking with her. "Just Azoth," Azoth said mildly, before he sent a wry smile to the exasperated Aina. "So this is your other adventurer?" "Yes," Aina sighed fondly as she looked down at the younger kid, before she rolled her eyes. "And it seems you're already acquainted." "Briefly," Azoth said, waving his hand nonchalantly. "Still, I think I'll leave you two to it. Then. Thanks a lot for the help though, Aina." "You're welcome, and remember, if you're taking Welf with you, don't go too deep into the dungeons. Have at least some thought for your fellow adventurers down there," Aina called after him, as he and Welf both gave their thanks for her help and started to head off. "I will," Azoth called back, sending the other elf a slight wave as he did so, before he headed for the doors, leaving Aina to do her job and deal with the overly excited-looking kid. "Now, Welf, do you reckon you could show me to my forge when we get back?" "Yeah, sure, no problem. Lady Hephaestus already told me which one you would be assigned. It's one of the sheltered ones in the back courtyard, the one next to mine." Welf shrugged, his pouch of coins jingling at his hip as he and Azoth exited the guild building and started heading for home. "Sounds good," Azoth smiled, his fingers twitching. It had been a while since he had felt the weight of a hammer in his hands and the heat of a hot forge against his flesh. "Back at Forgefire Manor. So I see Welf showed you to your forge," Hephaestus said mildly as she stepped into the outbuilding, the redhead's voice catching Azoth's attention as he looked up from his glowing forge and instead over to the goddess, a sheen of sweat covering his pale skin and causing the firelight to glimmer across his body as he gently placed a small hammer on an anvil and shoved the glowing length of metal he had been working on back into the bright hot coals of his forge. "Aye," Azoth nodded, glancing around at the small, but well-equipped, outbuilding. His eyes roving over the tiled roof overhead and the rough stone walls either side of him, along which were several racks of hammers, pincers, and other forging equipment, along with boxes of charcoal, wood, coal, and basic types of ore. "We got back from the guild building around an hour or so ago, and then he showed me this place. It's not a bad setup at all." "I'm glad," Hephaestus smiled, pushing off of the wall now and entering the building properly as she looked around at the formerly neat and unused forge, her single red eye trailing over the small mound of monster crystals she could see on a nearby work table, and the bag full of what looked like monster drops that was next to the mound of crystals. "You seem to have made yourself at home." "It's getting there," Azoth nodded, looking around the smithy too, and it was. That said, he did still need to build himself an arcane enchanting station sooner or later, otherwise he would run into some issues when it came to forging himself a new, stronger, better set of armor. Hephaestus hummed, walking along the nearly empty weapons rack on one side of the smithy, her fingers absent-mindedly trailing over Wuthrad's intricately shaped axe head. As she did so, before then moving over to the ornate hilt of Dawnbreaker, only for her to let out a slight hiss and withdraw her hand immediately the moment her finger brush against Meridia's sacred blade. Waving her stinging fingers in the air to try and get rid of the burning sensation, Hephaestus sent Azoth a curious look. "Yeah, Dawnbreaker doesn't tend to like being touched by other people," Azoth said mildly, leaning against the anvil in front of him as he gave the redhead an amused look. "The sword sentient?" Hephaestus asked, eyeing the glowing jewel in the hilt of the sword. As she did so, "No, or at least not in the sense you're most likely thinking. The sword has merely been instilled with its maker's desires and has, over the centuries, gained a bit of a personality. Semisentient is what I would call it," Azoth said shrugging. The blade was at its fiercest and most angry when used against undead, and those that it considered to be of that ilk. That said, it was liable to snap at the living too if they had dealt in necromantic magic, or if it just didn't like them, and thus didn't want them touching it. The same could be said of Wuthrad, the axe beside you too. He continued, his eyes trailing over to the ominous-looking axe, complete with the screaming face that dominated its head. The axe, according to legend, had been forged by Ingol, the son of Isgramor, from the ebony tears of rage, sorrow, and fury that the ancient Nord hero had shed after the fall of the ancient Nord city of Sarthal and the massacre of its populace at the hands of the snow elves, Azoth's people, in a night known as the Night of Tears. As such, the ancient, sentient axe yearned for elven blood and was at its most powerful and deadly when used against the fairer races. Suffice to say, Azoth found it quite amusing and ironic that its current wielder was him, a snow elf, most likely the last snow elf alive for that matter, or at least as far as he knew. For all intents and purposes, the axe should be thirsting for his blood above all others, but instead it aided him. Whether this loyalty and acceptance was due to him being the one to find its scattered pieces and reforge it in the Skyforge at Whiterun, thus imparting aspects of himself and his magic into the ancient blade, or whether it was due to it grudgingly recognizing him as the harbinger of the companions, the very group that its former master had founded, he wasn't sure. Not that it really mattered. No, all that did was that it accepted him as its master, and didn't thirst for his blood like it did for every other elf it came into contact with. I see, Hephaestus frowned, eyeing the sword and axe cautiously now as she did so. I take it this has something to do with the method in which you forge and enchant weapons. To some extent, though from I've seen and experienced, this semisentience is just as much to do with the age of the weapon as it is with the nature of its construction. Azoth shrugged, turning back to his forge now and pulling the glowing bar of metal out of it with a set of pincers. The age, how long do these weapons of yours last? Hephaestus asked mildly, leaning back against the wall, a safe distance from the enchanted axe and sword now, as she instead watched Azoth go back to pounding and working the glowing bar of metal. I'm not sure, though I'd say probably indefinitely, so long as you look after and maintain them, of course, that and you keep them well charged. Azoth shrugged, lifting the bar of metal up now as he checked its straightness. He would soon need to quench it and treat the metal. Impressive, Hephaestus muttered, a hint of admiration in her tone now. That level of smithing, although not unheard of, was still remarkable and immortal. After all, she knew that she herself was capable of making such a blade if she used her arcanum, but still, for a mortal to be able to do it, even if the weapons in question required recharging, was still impressive. Thanks, but smithing, like with anything, is an ever-evolving craft. Eventually I want to progress beyond my current level and forge weapons on a par with both Dawnbreaker and Wuthrad. Azoth continued to talk, looking over at the two ancient weapons now, before his attention went back to his blade as he quenched it in oil. An admirable goal, Hephaestus nodded. But not my only one, nor my most pressing one. Azoth shot back, raising the steaming blade to eye level now as he looked down its length and made sure it was still straight. Ah yes, the one-eyed black dragon, Hephaestus said mildly, her gaze still on the elven smith. From what she could see, he was making a rapier of some sort, a thin, long blade, the kind that was meant more for thrusting and stabbing than for slashing and hacking. With that in mind, I thought you were planning on forging armor, not a new sword. Oh, I am, Azoth said, a slight grin on his face now as he headed for the grindstone, content now in the strength and straightness of the blade. But it's been a few weeks since I last properly used a forge, and I need some practice. That and I don't have any strong enough material yet. The monsters on floors 1 through 11 were weak, and the bits and pieces I managed to harvest are, well, they aren't terrible, but they are nowhere near as high quality as I need. That understandable enough, Hephaestus nodded. She could understand his reasoning. Once you get to the lower levels, I am sure you will find things more to your liking and specifications. In fact, I believe that the Loki familiar is diving into the dungeon again very soon, and are heading for the very bottom, as low as any adventurer has ever gone before. I have no doubt that they'll soon be contacting me, requesting for some of my familiar members to head down there with them as supporters. I take it you'll accept their request when it comes? Azoth asked, looking up at Hephaestus. Now as he did so. I usually do, yes. The organization of who is going down there, the 50th floor and perhaps lower, will be up to Tsubaki though. So if you're interested, tell her and I'm sure she'll keep you in mind when coming up with the list of who will be heading down there. Hephaestus shrugged, pushing off of the wall now. Thanks, I'll make sure to do just that. Azoth nodded. A shortcut down to the lower floors. Would be greatly appreciated. Good, Hephaestus nodded. Anyway, I'll be heading off now. I just wanted to make sure you had settled in well. Though don't stay in here too long, like some of my children do, I believe. That dinner will be ready soon back at the manor's great hall. Azoth grinned at this news, his stomach letting out a pleased growl at the thought of food. Though I'm afraid I won't be joining you tonight, Hephaestus pressed on, a slight smile on her face now as she saw his grin, and heard his grumbling stomach. Oh, where are you off to then? Anywhere nice? Or rather, with anyone nice? Azoth smirked, his violet eyes twinkling as he saw the faintest of pink hues on Hephaestus's flawless face at his insinuation, before she quickly gathered her composure. I'm going to the Ganesha familiar's home, to the banquet of the gods. Hephaestus shot back. No more than that, and certainly nothing as untoward as what you're implying. Again Azoth couldn't help but grin. I don't know what you mean, I didn't imply anything of the sort. It was perhaps, Azoth mused, a difference in their respective cultures. Skyrim was a harsh place, people died easily, and so in turn lived freely. If you saw someone you took a fancy to, you told them, and if they reciprocated your feelings then the two of you would pair up until one or other of you were bored or dead. Courting in Skyrim was a simple, blunt thing, and as a resident of Skyrim all of his life, the culture had rubbed off on him. Suffice to say it appeared the culture here, in Aura Rio, was very different. Hephaestus hummed, a slight smile on her face now, as she shook her head in amusement. I like you, Azoth, you're an odd one, but you certainly have some character too. You. That said, do try to remember, I am a goddess, your new goddess. A bit of propriety. Wouldn't gotta miss. I'll keep that in mind, Azoth shot back, a smile still on his face as he saw the red-haired goddess give him one more part amused, part curious look, before she said her goodbyes and then left. The divine beings of this world were certainly a lot different to the ones of his old one. If he had said such a thing, or made such an implication to Meridia or Nocturnal, or any of the other Daedra for that matter, then they would likely have had his guts for garters, and would have had him shitting out his own heart before he could even take the words back. Honestly, he preferred things here. At least here the gods and goddess seemed to have a sense of humor. With Hephaestus walking purposefully through the doorway of the Ganesha familiar's compound, Hephaestus, who was currently wearing an expensive dress that was as red as her crimson hair, had to resist the urge to roll her eyes. She had known the god, Ganesha, for a long time, centuries in fact. But still, despite the length of their acquaintance, she had never really come to terms with just how over the top and eccentric the other god was. What with his proclivity for walking around with an elephant mask on, and his fashion choice being practically Amazonian in terms of its skimpiness. But still, despite these other oddities, the fact that he had not only had a massive statue in his likeness built at the front of his familiar home, but had positioned the entrance to his familiar home between the legs of said statue, was a step too far. It was nearing Apollo-like levels of ego and narcissism. Glancing sideways at two of Ganesha's elephant-masked familiar members, she gave the pair of them a nod of thanks as they opened the next set of doors for her and welcomed her into the palatial building that Ganesha called home. The wealth of his vast, hard-working familiar, clear to see as she looked around at the opulent party he was throwing, her single red eye taking in the hundreds of brightly, and in some cases gaudily, dressed gods and goddess that filled the room. Some of them wearing dresses and suits just as, if not more, expensive than her own, whilst others, those from smaller or poorer familiars, wore plainer, but still bright and showy, outfits. The banquet of the gods, for all of the pomp attached to the name, the event was simply a big party, and a chance for the gods and goddesses within the city, and outside of it for that matter, to interact on neutral ground, and in a mostly amicable manner. Though more often than not the event, as the night progressed, turned into a rowdy mess as the different gods and goddesses got drunker and drunker, and attempted to show off what they had, and what their children had done, all of them competing against one another, and trying to one-up one another, as they jockeyed for position in the city's vast and complex hierarchy, a hierarchy in which her familiar thankfully was high up in, even if it was not on the level of the largest and most powerful familiars, like Freya and Loki's. taking a glass of ruby wine from a nearby tray bearing member of the Ganesha familia. Hephaestus started to make her way through the thronging crowds of gods and goddesses, occasionally nodding or returning a greeting here and there as she looked for someone that she might want to speak to. Idling through the room, still smiling vaguely and nodding at gods and goddess that called out to her, some of whom she didn't even recognize, Hephaestus slowly began to make her way up a grandiose staircase, only for her to stop when she found her attention being drawn elsewhere, the sound of muttering gods and the content of their words reaching her as she turned to look over at the source of the commotion. Well, look who it is. I'm surprised she's even down here. I would have thought that that disaster of a goddess would have gone back to the heavens by now. Yeah, I know. I mean, I saw her working part-time at a food stand just a few days ago. I mean, how low can you go? Ugh, she might as well have just brought a bucket. You know, I always did think she was pretty hot. Not Freya or Ishtar hot, but still, hot none the less. Tuning out the meaningless drivel from the bitchy, insipid, low-ranking gods and goddess that were snidely talking behind their hands, Hephaestus instead smiled slightly and started to walk over to the object of their discussion, a short, extremely busty goddess with bright blue eyes and long dark hair, a goddess that was currently gorging herself at the buffet table and handily ignoring the catty comments from some of the surrounding gods and goddess. It was Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, and her good friend. Stuffing your face at the buffet table, I should have expected as much, Hephaestus said as she approached the considerably smaller, yet still exceptionally well-endowed goddess. The warmth in her tone and smile on her face taking away all the bite her words might have had. As she saw Hestia freeze up and then turn to look at her, her cheeks noticeably bulging with food, giving the naturally beautiful goddess the look of a hamster, something which made Hephaestus bring her hand up to her mouth in order to stifle a snort of laughter. It's been a while, Hestia. I'm glad to see you're doing well. Hephaestus continued, ignoring the muttering of the other gossiping gods and goddess around them, their critical comments rapidly fading to nothing as they saw that she was present and was a friend of Hestia's. Hephaestus. Hestia immediately shouted, thankfully upon swallowing her mouthful of food, the smaller goddess practically vibrating with joy at the sight of her. I knew you'd be here. So, I made the right choice coming here. Hephaestus cocked an eyebrow at that. You wanted to see me, heh? Well, let me make it clear to you now, I won't be lending you a single valice. How rude of you. Hestia exclaimed, her face flushing pink and her cheeks puffing up. What kind of goddess do you think I am? You've been leeching off of me ever since you came to Orario, so. Hephaestus replied, mildly, waving her hand nonchalantly in the air, even as she saw Hestia's outrage disappear in a second, to be replaced by an abashed look of embarrassment. That's a thing of the past. I'm no longer willing to mooch off of my friend's purse. Hestia proclaimed loudly, thrusting her chest out proudly as she did so, much to the audible pleasure of several of the more lecherous, nearby gods. But it seems like you're more than happy to mooch off of Ganesh's buffet table. Hephaestus pointed out, hiding a smile now as she saw Hestia flinch, her lips quirking upwards at the warm-hearted, but admittedly eccentric and over the top, though not to Ganesh's level, goddess, not mentioning as she did so, how she was currently letting Hestia stay rent-free in a partially dilapidated church that she owned on the outskirts of the city. No, I'm just keeping these as leftovers, Hestia said, a shifty smile on her face as she obviously tried to find a way to save face. Not that she really needed to, the two of them had known each other for thousands of years in the heavens, and their friendship had continued to be just as strong, even if she did like teasing the shorter goddess when they descended to live among the mortals. Well, I see you two still get along very well with one another, a voice suddenly said from behind her, cutting Hephaestus off before she could reply herself, the voice catching both Hephaestus and Hestia's attention as they turned to look at the speaker. At once Hephaestus's single crimson eye locked with a pair of bright, shining silver ones. The goddess in front of her was beautiful, even for a goddess, so much so that her porcelain skin and silver hair all seemed to glow with an inner light, and the slight smile on her inhumanely beautiful face was enough to make nearby gods and goddesses weak at the knees. Not Hephaestus though, nor Hestia either, as they both instead turned to face the newcomer. both of them standing side by side as the goddess in front of them smiled coyly at them, and continued to approach, her every movement lithe and sensual as she practically prowled towards them, like an apex predator hunting their prey. Truly Freya, the goddess of beauty, was a dangerous being. Just the sight of the inhumanely beautiful woman, her unnatural splendor emphasized as it was by the tight in all the right places dress she was wearing, was enough to make her, a powerful goddess in her own right, feel inadequate in comparison. Freya. Hestia spoke first, her voice lower than normal, and her tone more serious than it had been previously when Hephaestus had been bantering with her. Why are you here? Oh well, I just saw the two of you standing here and thought I would come over and say hello. Why, am I a bother, Hestia? Freya asked, a slight smile on her face as she took a sip from the goblet of wine in her hand. Not really, but I'm uncomfortable with you around, Hestia bluntly said. Hephaestus had to withhold a sigh at this. The fact she was so upfront was one of the best things about Hestia. Unfortunately, though, it could also be one of the most problematic. Oh, my, Freya laughed, a delighted light entering her eyes as she flashed Hestia and Hephaestus a smile, the sight of which making her even more tense. You're always so honest. It's what I like about you, Hestia. Continuing to smile as she said this, Freya's violet eyes shifted over to Hephaestus. And, Hephaestus, how have things been? Truly it is a rarity to see you at a party. Normally you hardly ever seem to tear yourself away from that forge of yours. Yes, well, I do socialize on occasion, Hephaestus replied lightly, taking a sip of her own wine here as she felt Freya's curious gaze studying her, like a cat would a particularly delectable bird. The goddess of beauty was up to something, or at least more than she normally was. She didn't normally search people out like this. Unfortunately, before either one of the three could speak again, however, all three of them were distracted by another loud and very familiar voice calling out to them. Hey, it's Freya. Looking up at the source of the voice, Hephaestus had to withhold a slight smile as she saw a thin, red-haired goddess practically running down the palatial hall's grand staircase, moving as fast as her very expensive-looking dress would allow. Oh, and it's Hephaestus too, and little itty bitty. The voice continued as Loki, the goddess of mischief, descended upon them, the hyperactive goddess practically vibrating with excitement as she joined their group, other gods and goddess moving swiftly out of the charging redhead's way. Oh no, not her. Hestia sighed, her comment getting a smile from both Hephaestus and Freya. Anybody but her. What was that itty bitty? Loki asked as she barged her way into the conversation with all the grace of an elephant. Loki, Hestia said stiffly, reluctantly turning to face the other goddess as she did so. What brings you here? What do you mean, pipsqueak? Do I really need a reason to be here? Loki replied, a sly smile on her face as she ran her eyes up and down Hestia's small, compact form. Seeing this, Hephaestus had to withhold a sigh, even as the two goddesses started to bicker like children, both of them throwing petty insults at one another, and mildly tussling, even as the other gods began to gather round and cheer them on. The two of them got like this every time they met. Sending a sideways glance at Freya, Hephaestus was surprised to see the amusement on the other goddess' face. It was typical of Freya to enjoy something like this, as if reading her mind. Freya chose that moment to raise her hand to her mouth, stifling a smile, even as she spoke. You two really do get along well. Like hell we do. Both Hestia and Loki shouted at the same time, turning away from each other and instead both looking over at the silver-haired goddess. Freya, however, merely smiled in response, before speaking again, noticeably steering the conversation away from the two of them arguing with one another, and instead to their familiars. So Loki, I hear about your familiar all the time. Things must be going well. Loki in response seemed puff her chest out slightly, a suddenly cocky smile on her face now. To hear someone with a familiar as good as yours say that. I must be moving up in the world. But yeah, my children are my pride and joy, all of them are pretty damn tough. Yes, so I've heard, Freya smiled, talking over Hestia, even as the smaller goddess looked like she was about to speak up. Though you're not the only one with strong familiar members, or at least from what a little birdie told me. Freya continued, her silver eyes flicking over to Hephaestus now. Oh yeah, A's and some my other children mentioned him. Loki nodded, her eyes, which Most of the time was squinted, opening slightly more as she suddenly eyed Hephaestus. Curiously. That white-haired elf, the level 6 one that kicked Beat's ass, Azoth wasn't it? A flash of sudden pride filled Hephaestus' heart as she heard the praise both Loki and Freya were heaping on her newest member. Yes, Azoth, he only just joined me, but he is pretty, strong, and a very skilled smith too. Oh yeah, I remember him. Big guy, really big for an elf, with the white hair and violet eyes. Hestia chipped in unexpectedly, before she began to pout adorably as she continued speaking. I met him when he first got to the city. I tried to recruit him to, but he wasn't interested. Huh, and why would he join a non-existent familiar like yours? Loki cackled, her voice once again sparking Hestia off as the two of them began to argue again, with Hestia loudly proclaiming that she had a familiar member now, Bel Cranel, only for Loki to continue, antagonizing her. Rolling her eyes at this, Hephaestus looked away from the bickering duo, only to find herself once again locking eyes with Freya, only for her to see, in that single moment, a sudden look of hunger in Freya's silver eyes. So this Azoth of yours? Freya practically purred, the tone of her voice raising the red head Smith's hackles. Yes, mine, remember that, Freya. Hephaestus shot back, her tone a slight bit sharper than before and her eye flashing with warning. She knew Freya's reputation. In fact, everyone knew her reputation. The goddess was infamous after all for collecting the souls of those she found interesting and bringing them into her familiar, even if it meant seducing and manipulating them to leave their old familiars and join hers. Not that anyone was bold enough to call her on it, or at least know publicly. Freya's familiar was the largest in Rio and probably the strongest too. Oh, don't worry so much, Hephaestus. I'm just curious is all. It's not often that such a strong person wanders in from outside of Rio. In fact, as far as I know, there were only 2 level 6s out there beyond the walls of Rio, those 2 captains in Kali's familiar. What were their names again? Arjana and Bake. Freya smiled, her eyes twinkling as she took another sip of wine. Yes, he is a bit of a rarity, but he is a good smith, a decent warrior, and from what I have seen, a good person too. Hephaestus said slowly, her eye still boring into Freya's silver ones. He's also a very content member of my familiar. Say no more, I was merely asking. Freya said, waving her hand nonchalantly, a smile still on her face. Hephaestus grunted, still a bit stiff as she continued to watch the smiling goddess warily for a moment, before looking back at where Loki and Hestia were still arguing, only now it had devolved from Hestia showing off her familiar member and deriding the crown jewel of Loki's familiar, Ace Wallenstein, to the two of them comparing boob size. A competition that the relatively flat-chested Loki was sure to lose. Seeing this, Hephaestus couldn't help but sigh. Sometimes she found it difficult to process the fact that they too were immortal goddess, especially when they showed less maturity than even her most immature familiar member. Chapter end notes. So there we go. Hope you all enjoyed the chapter. I had been hoping to get to the Monsterphilia Festival, but that will have to wait until next time. Still, the story is now heading in a specific direction, one which will see Azoth dipping in and out of the Sword Oratoria storyline and the main storyline, with a few original arcs here and there, scattered in amongst him getting to know his new familiar, settling into his new home, and beginning his pursuit of his goals. Suffice to say, there is still a lot of ground I want to cover with this story, so I hope you keep reading and supporting, and do review if you have the chance. Hope you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you later. Greed 720. Chapter notes. Chapter 11. So it has been quite a while, hasn't it? Sorry about that, I've just been quite busy with everything that's been going on. That, and I was distracted by the many other stories I've committed myself to writing and updating. Still, I got it out eventually, even if it is later than I intended, and am slowly getting back into the swing of things. Hopefully soon I'll start to update more regularly. Not much else to say other than that, so I hope you enjoy the chapter and leave a review. Thanks for reading. Disclaimer, I do not own Danmachi or the Elder Scrolls. Last time. Say no more, I was merely asking. Freya said, waving her hand nonchalantly, a smile still on her face. Hephaestus grunted, still a bit stiff as she continued to watch the smiling goddess warily for a moment, before looking back at where Loki and Hestia were still arguing, Only now it had devolved from Hestia showing off her familiar member and deriding the crown jewel of Loki's familiar, Ace Wallenstein, to the two of them, comparing boob size. A competition that the relatively flat-chested Loki was sure to lose. Seeing this, Hephaestus couldn't help but sigh. Sometimes she found it difficult to process the fact that their two were immortal goddess, especially when they showed less maturity than even her most immature familiar member. See the end of the chapter for more. In Azoth's Forge. Notes. I thought I'd find you in here. Tsubaki Colbrand spoke up, a sly smile on her face as she nonchalantly leant against the door frame to his forge. Azoth just grunted in response, his gaze not straying from the dull silver blade in his hand as he gently placed it against the spinning grindstone he was sat in front of, sparks spraying off of the blade as it made contact. So is that the first piece you've made in this forge? Tsubaki tried again, her one visible eye narrowing as she took in the shape and width of the sword, as well as the delicate swirling patterns, like smoke, that ran up and down its length. The sword was perfectly straight, and maybe 3 feet in length. Currently, though, it had neither a pommel, a crossguard, nor handle, but those were just extra additions. For the most part, the blade looked finished, or at least fully forged. All that seemed to be left to do was sharpen the blade and then polish it up a bit. Yes, Azoth finally replied, moving the sword away from the grindstone now as he instead brought it up to eye level and looked down the edge. The edge looked fine, but not too fine. Enough that it would cut, but not so fine that it would quickly pick up damage. To her own discerning eye, it looked like a good, if simple, sword. It's a simple blade. Azoth continued putting words to her thoughts, a slight frown on his face as he tested along the edge with his thumb. But a solid one all the same. So not one of your enchanted blades then? Tsubaki asked curiously, her gaze flicking to the nearby weapons rack as she spoke, taking note of the sword and great axe that were hung up there before she looked back to the tall elf. She had heard of his weapons from Hephaestus. Apparently they were impressive, and if the goddess of smithing said that, then that truly meant something. Not yet, Azoth replied, gently placing the blade down on a folded-up piece of cloth as he did so, his attention instead moving to a simply crafted crossguard and pommel that lay nearby, and the 2 sanded-down pieces of wood and 2 metal pins that sat next to them. If the sword passes muster, I might give it a simple enchantment. Maybe a frost enchantment, to help slow down enemies. I've honestly not decided. You want to imbue the sword with magic after you've already made it? Tsubaki asked, I widening slightly in interest. She knew how to make magic swords herself, but the ones she made required magic to be used during the forging, not after. In response, Azoth's eyes narrowed and his posture stiffening as he turned to face her. The sight of this almost made Tsubaki smile. Blacksmiths, like many artificers and artisans, jealously guarded their craft. Or at least they guarded the techniques behind their craft. After all, if anyone could replicate them, then it would devalue their work and thus make all the hard work and experimentation they had put into creating their own unique style and techniques worthless. It didn't even matter that they were in the same familiar. None of them gave up their hard-won and hard-earned secrets easily or freely. Not her, not Leo, not Welf, not Agile, not even Hephaestus herself. The familiar was built around blacksmithing and crafting, and self-improvement and innovation. Bartering secrets and new ideas was okay, whether it be for materials or in exchange for something else. It happened all the time. But just giving them away freely, even to each other, that was not the done thing, not here. Not even Hephaestus was exempt. Whenever she desired to learn one of her children's techniques or use one of their designs, she struck a bargain with them first. I do, Azoth finally spoke, interrupting Tsubaki's thoughts as he did so. His expression smoothing out, as a slight smile instead played across his face. I use a specially designed runic table to imbue enchantments into my equipment. Oh, and where is this table? Tsubaki asked, her smile widening and her curiosity peaking. Maybe Azoth wasn't as secretive as the rest of their familiar. She wouldn't pry too much, after all. She didn't want to take advantage. But she wouldn't say no to learning a bit more basic information if she could. Not built it yet, he replied shortly, barely looking up from his sword as he continued to inspect it in minute detail, even as he gestured vaguely to one of the corners in his forge. Glancing in the direction he gestured, Sabaki quickly spotted a plain wooden table with a plate of metal on top and a number of other things scattered across it, including candles, a skull of some kind, and several other pieces of metal. None of it was assembled. Instead it was all lazily piled up on the table. Once I have a bit of time, I'll engrave the runes on the plate and set start to it up. Azoth continued, standing up now as he instead went over to where he had set aside the cross guard, pommel and handle. It's not difficult to set up, not if you know how. The difficult part is getting the resources you need to properly use it. And what resources are those? She asked curiously. Now that is a secret. Azoth smiled, fitting the cross guard onto the sword as he did so. I'll be happy to tell you my process though, if you share with me how you build your adamantine weapons. You don't know how to work adamantine? Sabaki asked in surprise. The metal was finicky to work with at the best of time and required a true master smith to truly get the best out of it. There were not many smiths out there that were skilled enough and knowledgeable enough to construct and maintain adamantine weapons and armor, and those that did know how often jealously guarded their secrets. No, which is why I'm asking. Azoth chuckled, setting the sword down now as he instead picked up a hammer and some pins and began to fit and attach the pieces of carved wood to the hilt. Sabaki rolled her eyes at the nonchalant response. I take it that you're thinking of crafting your new armor out of it. Yes, that, or I'll use dragon bones. Azoth nodded, checking the grip of his new sword now, his long, pale, dexterous fingers wrapping around the hilt, and then moving to check that the panels of wood were aligned and well fitted, after which he grabbed a nearby strip of leather and began to skillfully wrap it around the hilt in a plaited weave. Dragon bone? Sabaki asked, her eyes widening at the mention of the unusual material. I can't say I've ever seen a suit of armor made wholly from bone before. Wouldn't it be too brittle? No, if the bone is properly treated it is fine, especially if it is strong and resilient like dragon bone. As for working it, well, there is a technique to that too. Besides, I'll be using some metal work to fit it together and reinforce the joints. Azoth smiled again. It was a nice smile, Sabaki mused, even as she ignored the previous comment and focused back on the matter at hand. It was difficult though. The promise of new smithing techniques was a difficult lure to resist. Either way, I think you are overestimating yourself if you think you can make an armor entirely out of adamantine or dragon bone. Adamantine ore is rare, especially since all the veins on the first 30 or so floors of the dungeon have been completely depleted. To get the amount you want, you'd need to dungeon dive to the lowest levels, a lot, and for long periods of time, which, as you might imagine, is pretty dangerous and time-consuming. No risk, no reward. Azoth replied simply, moving to fit the pommel on his sword now. You might be a level 6 kid, but in the dungeon that doesn't matter. Even level 6s will eventually get cut down and butchered if they head down too far and for too long, especially if they are alone. Sabaki rolled her eyes. Azoth might be an elf, but she could tell from the way he spoke, his attitude and general demeanor, that he was not particularly old, probably only 20 or so. As such, he's still likely suffering from the reckless and arrogant folly of youth. Then I best not go down by myself. Azoth smiled again, taking up his hammer again. The sound of metal striking metal sounding out as he hammered the pommel into the hilt. Besides, I'm in no rush. I'll probably build a temporary set of armor first, maybe try out some new techniques if I pick any good ones up, and well, I'll have fun with it. Sabaki hummed, before she let out a sigh. Well, if that's what you want. But suggestion, if you are looking to build some cheap but good quality armor and want to use dragon bone to do so, I would suggest hunting down some of the infant dragons on the middle floors. They are not too tough, and although their bones are smaller and nowhere near as dense as the dragons on the deeper floors. Thanks, Azoth nodded, standing up as he did so, the sword now gripped in his hand as he took a few practice swings with it. How is it? Sabaki asked curiously. His form was not bad, but it was not perfect either. She had seen better swordsmen, well balanced and light. Azoth said, not my best work, but good enough. With that said, he turned and offered the sword to her. Taking it from him, she straightaway understood what he meant by light. It was still much heavier than a dagger, but despite that it was much lighter than a sword its size and thickness. Should be. It was probably a third as light as it should be, heavy enough that swings with it. Still had power behind them, but light enough that it could be moved swiftly and rapidly. Through the air. Taking a few practice swings, a smile made its way across Tsubaki's face. It was a good sword, and it felt well balanced too. Laying the flat of the sword across her finger, she checked to make sure. Not perfect after all. Your blade is half a gram too heavy on one side. Only if you're feeling picky. Azoth rolled his eyes, taking his sword back from her as he did. So, but otherwise, it is a beautiful piece. If you get Lady Hephaestus's approval you could probably sell it for 500,000 valors, as it is now. Add on a suitably strong enchantment, and you're looking at a couple of million. Not bad for a day or so of work, EY. She laughed, clapping him on the shoulder as she did so. Azoth nodded at that, a slight smile on his face as he reached over to the work table and scooped up a simple, brown leather scabbard and sheathed the blade. Speaking of the dungeon I hear that you might be heading down there soon with the Loki familiar. Blinking slightly at the sudden change in topic, it took her a few minutes to digest his question before she nodded, a sly smile already spreading across her face. That I am. Why? Do you want in? I wouldn't mind it. Azoth nodded, his expression turning serious. I'll keep you in mind then. We probably won't be going for a couple of weeks, but I will let you know what Lady Hephaestus and I decide on. She replied. She wasn't going to give him any more than that. The white-haired elf might be strong and tough, but he obviously wasn't experienced with dungeon diving. Whether or not she brought him along very much depended on how she thought he would do in the dungeon. She didn't want him to falter or get in over his head when they were on the deepest floors. To do so would not only put him at risk but all of them. That said, she had a good opinion of him so far. I appreciate it. Azoth nodded, thankfully not pushing the matter here and now like some adventurers would have done. But anyway, Tsubaki said, changing the topic of conversation now herself. That's not why I came in here. No, I came to kick you out of the forge. Excuse me. Azoth replied, his brow furrowing as his violet eyes bored into her. It's monstophilia, and you're new to the city. You shouldn't be cooped up in here, you should be out exploring. Tsubaki continued undeterred. Now come on, you're coming out. With us. Leo, Charles, Elizabeth, and even Welf are waiting for us in the main hall. Cocking an eyebrow at this, Azoth looked to be on the verge of shooting her down. Oh come on, it's fun, and it'll be a good way for you to get to know your familiar. It's hard enough getting us all together at the best of times. She pressed on earnestly, her one visible eye locking with his. With how dedicated most of the familiar was to their craft, it was not an easy job at all corralling them and persuading them to go out together. Not when they all wanted to stay locked up in their forges, or in the shop selling their wares, or out buying new materials or harvesting them in the dungeon. Letting out a slight sigh, Azoth nodded. Fine, he said, grabbing up his newly forged sword. I'll just go put something clean on. Good, be down in around 10. Tsubaki smiled, clapping him on the shoulder one more time, before she turned and swept out of his forge. And don't look so dour, the festival is fun, you'll enjoy it. Elsewhere in Orario. Settling down at her table, Freya looked down from the veranda she was sat at the busy streets of Orario below. A small smile of contentment spreading across her face as she drank her tea in peace and just watched the world go by. This was her temporary sanctuary, away from the bustling streets of Orario and the chattering children that inhabited it. This cafe was originally owned and started by a former member of her familia, and now it was run by that familia member's grandchild. As a primary stakeholder though, even now many years later, she was still allowed to book the whole veranda out as and when she pleased. She didn't do it often, but sometimes her fellow gods got too whiny and annoying, or her children got too clingy and started bickering and squabbling to get her attention. It sometimes became too much, and she just needed space and time to herself. Taking another sip of the sweet tea, Freya continued her observations. Her silver eyes moved over the teeming masses of mortals as they sold merchandise from their stalls or chatted animatedly about the entertainment that would soon be starting in the amphitheater. It was Monstophilia, or Monsterferia as it was once called, a festival that allowed the different familiars to showcase their influence and wealth, or at least that was what it once was a few centuries ago. A chance for the familiars and their gods to show off and try to one-up one another. Nowadays, though, few familiars still tried to take an active part in it beyond the crafting and farming familiars selling their wares and produce. Instead, the festival had been usurped by the Ganesha familiar, with the main highlight of the festival being in the amphitheater where the different members of that blowhard Ganeshas familiar showed off their monster-taming abilities and wowed and dazzled the crowds of simple-minded onlookers. It was a somewhat tiring experience for her, especially since whenever she deigned to sit in on one of the performances, she was swarmed by the other lesser gods and goddesses asking for favors or trying to cling onto her coattails in the hopes that by merely being in her presence their place in the hierarchy of Ororio will change. It was not her cup of tea. Smiling to herself at that thought, Freya took another sip of what was her cup of tea and let out another sigh. Sometimes she just needed some alone time. As if the world was trying to spite her, the sound of a familiar loud, obnoxious voice sounded out from inside of the cafe. Her smile wavered slightly as she set her cup down on the table. Sometimes she needed that time away from others, but now was unfortunately not going to be that moment. Pulling the black cloak she was wearing to hide her identity tighter around her, Freya settled more comfortably into her seat as she waited for her guest to be shown through onto the veranda. "Yo, sorry to keep you waiting." A loud voice called out cheerfully, shattering the calm silence she had otherwise been enjoying as the person she had invited finally arrived. Setting down her tea, Freya forced a pleasant smile onto her face as she turned and saw Loki walking up to her, accompanied by a petite, blonde woman with a doll-like face and golden eyes. Loki's favorite pet, the famed sword princess. "No need for apologies, you're right on time. I just came a little early," Freya said, her smile still present as she forced aside her distaste of the crass redhead and instead turned to look at the blonde swordswoman. "And she is?" "Ah, right, this is probably the first time you've met. This is Ace from my familiar. That's enough of an introduction for you." Loki introduced her child, her tone brusque and dismissive, a complete contrast to the sudden sharpness that entered her gaze. Seeing the expression on the other goddess' face made Freya's smile slightly more genuine. She had a bit of a reputation, she already knew that. Not that that bothered her. After all, it was amusing to see how wary some of the other gods and goddesses got around her. They were fearful that she would charm their strongest children away from them and instead entice them to her familiar. Smiling slightly wider now, Freya continued to watch Ace closely for a moment, looking beyond her fleshy exterior and to what really mattered, her soul. The rumors about her were not unfounded. After all, if she ever saw a soul that caught her eye, well, she liked to collect and surround herself with beautiful things. It was part of the game. "Ace," Loki continued, her eyes narrowing warningly at Freya as she moved to take the seat across the table from the other goddess. "You might not think it to look at her in her hood and black cloak, but this is the goddess Freya, so at least greet her." "Hello." The girl introduced herself with a nod, her head tilting minutely to the side in curiosity as she met Freya's silver eyes, only for a slight hint of pink to then spread across her cheeks, and surprise to enter her eyes as she did so. It seemed, Freya thought, that not even the emotionless doll was immune to her charm. "She's as impressive as I had heard. I can see why you like her so much," Freya said pleasantly, and she was being honest. The A's girl had a strong soul, one which shone a vibrant gold color, on top of which there was something different about her too, something far more complex than she had seen in the run-of-the-mill adventurer. Though just what that was would have to wait for later. For now she wanted to get down to business. After all, she had not invited Loki out here for just a chat. "So tell me, Loki, why'd you bring her with you?" "Well, you know, with the monsterphilia going on, I'm planning on going out to have some fun with Ace here. We're on a date, you know." Loki grinned widely, her distrustful expression clearing as she instead gave Ace a fond look, like a master would to a favorite pet. "Plus, if I leave her alone, she's sure to dive right back into the dungeon. If someone doesn't take care of her, she'll spend her whole life without a break. I tell you, sometimes she works too hard for her own good." Freya smiled at that. It was sometimes necessary to humor Loki. The other goddess was odd one at the best of times. She mingled too freely with the mortals, and more often than not, forgot her place. It was distasteful really, how she acted like a clown, like comic relief, allowing her children to mock and make fun of her. It was sad really, and pitiful. Still, it was none of her business. If that was how Loki wanted to spend her time on the mortal plane, then that was up to her. Every god and goddess that had come down to the mortal plane from the heavens had had a reason for doing so. They all had their own games to play. Lovely, Freya smiled, though training should never be discouraged. Especially since I've heard rumors that your familiar will be going back into the dungeon again soon, on a much longer and deeper expedition. In fact, I've heard that you are looking to go further down than anyone, save for the Zeus familiar, has ever gone before. Oh, it looks like you've heard a lot then. Loki replied, her smile vanishing as her eyes narrowed warily. It also sounds like some people have been being too free with their tongues. Yes, well, mortals like gossip, you know. Freya replied dryly. You say that like gods and goddesses don't. Loki shot back, and she had a point. Gods and goddesses were 1,000 times worse than mortals when it came to gossip. So is that why you called me here? Partly. Freya shrugged carelessly, settling back in her seat as she did so, her eyes still fixed on Loki. I was hoping to inquire as to whether you would be taking any familiar members from outside of your own familiar with you. So it's about a guy then? Loki said bluntly, her caution giving way to resigned amusement. Of course it's about a guy. Freya simply smiled back, seemingly confirming Loki's assumption. Seeing this, the goddess of mischief just sighed and leant back in her chair. Really? That's why you dragged me all the way down here and interrupted my date, because you saw another guy you want to sink your hooks into? Pushing back the hint of annoyance she felt at the goddess of mischief's words, Freya instead sat straight again and shook her head. As I said, it's not the only reason I asked to speak with you. I also wanted to discuss with you the possibility of making your expedition into a joint one between our two familiars. Loki stiffened slightly at the suggestion, caution and concern suddenly entering her gaze as she sat up straighter in her chair and locked eyes with Freya. This is unexpected, Loki said slowly. Really? Freya smiled innocently. Okay, so what are you suggesting here? And why are you suggesting it? Loki finally asked. After a few moments of thought, her distrust was clear to hear in her voice. I am merely offering some support. I was thinking of maybe sending a couple of my level 5s and even a few level 6s with you, just to help bolster your ranks. As for why, well, isn't helping out a fellow goddess enough? We all want to find out what is at the bottom of the dungeon after all. That, and the guild does encourage the larger familiars, like our own, to do regular expeditions into the dungeon. Freya replied smoothly, a beautiful smile on her face now. The kind of smile that would make a normal, weak-willed mortal fall instantly in love with her. If it was anyone else, maybe, Loki sighed, before she shook her head. Let me guess, the real reason is because you are after someone from someone else's familiar, right? Which means that they are either someone in my familiar or someone in one of the familiar's we'll likely be bringing with us. That narrows it down quite a bit. Since I don't think you're foolish enough to poach one of mine, I'm going to guess it is from another's familiar, and, going off what I heard at that banquet, you're after Hephaestus's new boy toy, the elf Azoth, right? Freya tilted her head to the side curiously at Loki's dissection of her actions. Sometimes it was surprising to see how intelligent Loki actually was beneath all of her bluster and clownishness. I'll admit I am curious about the elven child, yes. The A's girl noticeably stiffened at her words. Unfortunately, though, her face and eyes gave away nothing of what she was thinking or feeling, even to Freya's discerning eye. Hey, well, you're not the only one curious. A level 6 like him turning up out of nowhere, and with no history, and with no one knowing anything about him. That's not something that happens. Something about the whole thing reeks of conspiracy. It is not possible for a level 6 to have gotten that strong without anyone having taken notice. Loki said, a frown on her face as she began to drum her fingers on the table. Hephaestus claims he had a goddess. Before her, someone called Merida. You ever heard the name before? No, it is not familiar. Freya shook her head. She too had heard the name from Hephaestus, but had found out nothing about her. She had even asked her contacts and scoured her library, and there was nothing. But I too share your skepticism. There is something unnatural about the child. And let me guess that's why you want him. Loki snorted with laughter. Freya just smiled in response. Loki was correct. She had seen the child's soul, and it was, without doubt, the brightest and strangest she had ever seen. Where all other mortals' souls were just one color, Azoth's soul was made up of hundreds, maybe even thousands, of different colors and shades. It was a complex tapestry, one that was impossible to fully understand, even for one such as herself. It was like he contained 1,000 other souls in his body, like he was a conglomeration of 1,000 different lives, maybe past lives, in a single form. It was the only explanation she had for what she saw, impossible though it might be. But then again, that was why she wanted him. She wanted to talk to him, to find out what made him tick, what made him hot. She wanted to understand him as a person, and then divine the true nature of his impossible soul. He was a puzzle, a conundrum, that she could not resist wanting to solve. Okay, fine, Loki finally nodded. I'll pass on your offer to Finn. Since he's the one leading the expedition, it is up to him over whether or not to accept your assistance. Though if we are to do this, I take it you'll be putting up some money to help fund the expedition too. There was a greedy glint in Loki's eyes as she said that. The sight of it almost made her roll her own eyes at the other divine being's pettiness. I would be amenable to that. Aha, Loki nodded, a slight smile still playing around her mouth. You know Hephaestus is going to be pissed if you steal away her newest kid. Hell, she might even ban you and your familiar from her shops and from buying her wares. I doubt that she would ever be that foolish, Freya said, waving Loki's comments away dismissively, like an errant fly. As the most powerful familiar in Rio, she and her children had little to fear from Hephaestus. If it came down to it, she could and would strong-arm the other goddess into reversing any sanctions she might want to dish out. You never change, do you? Loki rolled her eyes. One of these days you're going to fly too close to the sun and get burnt. Maybe, but not today, I think. Freya smiled, picking up her still warm tea and taking another sip of it as she did so. Now that she had dealt with Loki and made her offer of support on the upcoming expedition, it was time for her to have some fun of her own. Azoth wasn't the only soul that had caught her attention after all. There was another soul. One which was simple, where his was complex. Weak where his was strong. Pure where his was corrupted. The contrast between the two was truly delightful. With Azoth walking down the streets wearing a fresh white shirt, wool coat and leather trousers, his newly forged sword sheathed and strapped to his hip, Azoth couldn't help but grin as he looked around at all the stores and festival goers. There were more people here than he had ever seen in one place, or at least in one place outside of a battlefield. It was amazing. The vibe in the city was infectious, and he, like the rest of his familia, was getting caught up in it. Oi, Azoth! Leo shouted from nearby as both he and Charles returned from a nearby pop-up stall that was selling beer, several wooden flagons of ale in each hand as they returned to the group. This is your first time to Monsterphilia, isn't it? Taking the ale that was offered to him by the half-elf, Azoth took a long gulp of it and let out a sigh, smacking his lips together as he did in a distinctly undignified way. Yeah, never been to the city before. Haha, well, you're in for a treat then. Leo grinned, slapping him on the shoulder. You want to head over and see the main event, the monster taming, or we can get more beer. Charles offered with a smirk, downing his flagon of beer. Moments later, I'll drink to that. Erhard, another member of the Hephaestus familia, a bald, tanned human with a cheerful, solid disposition, nodded, a bright smile on his face as she clapped Charles on the back after he began coughing, a foam moustache visible on the younger human's upper lip. Laughing at this, Welf shook his head. There's plenty to do and see, and the taming will be going on all day. There's no rush. Yeah, besides, I want to get some food first. Lisbeth, the pink-haired Paulum, tagged on, rolling her eyes at the two heavily built humans' antics. How about Sabiki? How about we go grab some food? Can do. Do you lot want to get some tables and we'll bring it over? After that we can go to the amphitheater and see the taming. Sabaki nodded, a smirk on her face as she allowed herself to be pulled away by the impatient pink-haired, childlike blacksmith, the captain of the familiar, deliberately grabbing onto Welf's coat as she was pulled away. And you can give us a hand, Welfie. Ugh, do I have to? Welf groaned, sending a scowl in Leo's direction as the short half elf started cackling in delight at the redhead's misfortune. Not sure what you're laughing about, short fry. Erhard chuckled. You're coming with me to get another round of beer. What? But I just went. Leo complained, not that he put up much of a fight as Erhard dragged him away. Instead, the half-elf just rolled his eyes and downed the rest of his drink. Taking another gulp of his beer, Azoth couldn't help but laugh at his familiar members' shenanigans. It reminded him so much of his time in the companions, the camaraderie, and the inside jokes. Looks like it's up to us to get the tables then. Charles chuckled, a grin on his face as he looked over at the white-haired elf. The two Smiths were a complete contrast to one another. Where Azoth was tall and broad-shouldered, with white hair, delicate facial features and porcelain skin, Charles was much shorter and stockier, with dark skin, plain features and short messy black hair. Sounds like a plan. Azoth nodded, smiling back at the affable human as he did so. With that said, the two of them started to make their way through the streets, looking around, as they did for a nearby free table, or free place for them to sit and eat. Unfortunately, however, the two of them had barely made it a few steps before the atmosphere suddenly changed, and screams started to sound out in the distance. Chapter end notes. And it was looking to be such a peaceful day, one full of fun and friendship. Pity it couldn't last. I do enjoy writing the dialogue between the blacksmith of the Hephaestus. Familiar. So yep, hope you all enjoyed the chapter and haven't given up on the story yet. Things will be kicking off soon with the plot, so I hope you all stay tuned. Thanks a lot for reading, and I hope you leave a review. If you have any questions, feel free to PM me. I tend to be quite good at answering those. Thanks a lot. Greed 720. Chapter notes. Chapter 12. So here is the next chapter. Hope you enjoy. It is a bit action-heavy, more so than I usually like to do, but hopefully you all enjoy it. Not much to say other than that, except that I've caught up with the anime now, and have to say the story is getting interesting. These Xenos are an interesting idea. I'd already been vaguely aware of them from my research for the last couple of chapters, but now I'm more knowledgeable. Have to say I have some interesting ideas I want to play around with when it comes to them. So yep, hope you enjoy the chapter and leave a review, etc. Disclaimer, I do not own Elder Scrolls or Danmachi. Last time, the two Smiths were a complete contrast to one another. Where Azoth was tall and broad-shouldered, with white hair, delicate facial features and porcelain skin, Charles was much shorter and stockier, with dark skin, plain features and short messy black hair. Sounds like a plan. Azoth nodded, smiling back at the affable human as he did so. With that said, the two of them started to make their way through the streets, looking around as they did for a nearby free table, or free place for them to sit and eat. Unfortunately, however, the two of them had barely made it a few steps before the atmosphere suddenly changed, and screams started to sound out in the distance. See the end of the chapter for more. Notes. With Azoth. What's going on? Beckendorf shouted, his hands shooting down for the non-existent weapon at his hip, only for him to realize that he, like many of the other festival goers, had not brought a weapon. Trouble. Azoth replied bluntly, drawing his newly forged sword as he did so, before he then turned and faced in the direction of the screams and shouting. He could already see people running in their direction, away from the disturbance and the amphitheater in the distance. Furthermore, he could hear roars now too, and inhuman bellows. The sounds of monsters. Monsters by the sounds of it. Azoth continued, his eyes narrowing as he stared down the boulevard, his gaze searching the thronging rush of people heading their way as he tried to spot whether there were any monsters in their number. Well, let's go help out then. Beckendorf replied, veering off slightly as he lunged over the counter of a nearby food stall, his legs waving almost comically in the air behind him as he rootled about with something in the stall, with the owners of the stall looking on in shock and confusion as the sounds of fighting sounded out in the distance, and more civilians ran past the stall. Fine, let's go. Azoth nodded, a frown on his face as he brushed a couple of fleeing civilians aside with his free hand, before looking back over at Beckendorf. What are you doing? Arming myself. Beckendorf grinned, his feet landing back on the ground now as he turned away from the now vacated stall. The owners by this point had run, and looked at him. In his hands Azoth could see Charles now had a meat cleaver and a chopping knife. We're not making a feast, you know. Azoth replied dryly, a wry smile on his face as he took in his companion's weapons. I'm improvising. Beckendorf grinned again, before his expression became slightly more serious as more people ran past him, and he nodded in the direction of the chaos ahead. Come on, let's go. We shouldn't hang about. Let's find out just what in the hell is happening out there. Right. Azoth nodded, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword as he started forward. By his side Beckendorf did the same, both of them shouldering their way through the throngs of fleeing people as they made for the nearby sounds of violence and carnage. Azoth didn't know what was going on, but, by the sounds of it, there were monsters loose in the city. No doubt they were escapees from the Monsterphilia festival. After all, how else could the monsters have gotten up here? Unless, of course, they had rushed the entrance to the dungeon and broke out that way. Azoth shook his head at the worrying thought. In the end, it didn't matter right at this moment, just why the monsters were here. Instead, the focus needed to be on the fact that they were here and running amok. Their presence, he knew, at least explained the panic. After all, despite boasting the highest population of adventurers and gods and goddesses in the world, Auroria was still mostly made up of normal, everyday humans, demi-humans, elves, and dwarfs. Approximately 3/4 of the city's population were just normal and mundane people. Everyday folk that just peacefully went on with their lives. They were the type of people that never ventured into the dungeon after fame and glory, but instead profited off of supporting those that were foolish enough to do such a thing. With monsters loose in the city, it was no wonder they were panicking. Most had probably never even seen a monster in person, save perhaps for in the controlled taming events the Genera familiar through. As such, seeing wild and uncontrolled monsters in the flesh for the first time must be a terrifying experience. Pushing roughly through the crowds, Azoth also took note of a few people that looked like adventurers mingling in with the crowds as they fled from the nearby fighting. Or at least, people that dressed the part of adventurers and had weapons. That was another thing with the city. Despite having such a large population of adventurers, the vast majority of them were level 1, which meant that although they were tougher than normal people, they could only really deal with low-level monsters. They wouldn't stand a chance against some of the mid-level monsters that the Genera familiar had brought up to the surface for the festival. Or at least that was what he assumed, considering that he could see more than a few of them fleeing with the crowd. After all, why else would they flee, unless the monsters that were free and roaming the city were stronger than the garden variety creatures that roamed around on the upper floors of the dungeon? Looking down at his casual clothing at that thought, Azoth grimaced. He wasn't wearing armor, and neither was Beckendorf. Neither of them had come out expecting to be attacked. Instead, they had come out hoping to get drunk and have fun. They were both woefully unprepared for a fight. Still, Azoth thought as he gritted his teeth, that wasn't going to stop them. Looks like we're nearly there, Beckendorf said, a scowl on his face as he shoved one of the last few stragglers out of the way as they made it onto one of Aurorio's main market squares. The previously affable man, looking pretty tense now as he then proceeded to look around at the ongoing battle and carnage around them. Azoth nodded curtly at that. Beckendorf was right. Scowling as they made it onto the square, Azoth's violet eyes narrowed as they locked onto the first and biggest of the monsters he could see in the square. It was a giant, stone-skinned gargoyle with bat-like wings, long muscled limbs and claws, and a snarling bestial face. Shit. Beckendorf cursed as he too looked over at the gargoyle, before then looking down at his improvised weapons. Azoth knew exactly what he was thinking. Neither the cleaver nor the knife he had purloined would be of much use against a monster as durable as the gargoyle looked. Hell, even his sword might struggle to get through the monster's granite-colored flesh. Clear out some of the smaller ones, Azoth muttered, nodding over to the edges of the square where several other adventurers could already be seen fighting off other monsters. Some of them fully armored and armed, whilst others had done as Charles had improvised. Dotted amongst them, Azoth could also see a couple of elephant mask-wearing members of the Genera familiar, wielding spears and axes as they tried to corral a large, vicious-looking boar. Right. Beckendorf nodded curtly, following Azoth's gaze as he did so. Before he looked back at him. If you need a hand, give me a shout. Azoth smiled at that. It was a bit of a perfunctory statement considering that Beckendorf was only level 3, whilst he was a level 6. But even so, He appreciated the thought. With that said, Beckendorf gave him one more look before he rushed across the square and barreled into a snarling snake-like creature with clawed hands and a humanoid face and upper body, his cleaver already slashing through the air and gouging into the hissing creature's side, even as 3 other adventurers used the distraction his appearance created to close in and inflict their own wounds and attacks on the monster with spears. Nodding at this, Azoth then turned back to his own opponent, violet eyes locked with burning red as he gripped his sword tighter and stepped forward. Already he could see the bloody, slain bodies of both civilians and adventurers alike littering the square, along with the remains of slain monsters and the occasional pile of ash and dust. 2. Already he could see blood was spreading from the felled mortals and seeping into the ground. It looked like a battleground. No, Azoth scowled. That wasn't right. This wasn't a battleground. It was a slaughter. This was monsters attacking innocent, unarmed, vulnerable people by surprise. Gritting his teeth in anger at that thought, Azoth let loose a roar and charged at the gargoyle. The gray-skinned monster mimicked him as it did the same, both of its claws scraping furrows in the ground as it rushed him, its burning red eyes practically glowing. Meeting the monster in combat, Azoth was the first to attack, his sword whistling through the air as he swung it in a wide slash. The silver blade was practically a blur as it forced the gargoyle to back off for a moment, its red eyes widening with some kind of crude, animalistic intelligence as it gave ground instead of following through with its initial rush. Grinning at this, Azoth raised his free hand and unleashed an explosive fireball at the gargoyle, even as he pressed his advantage. Now he had the monster on the back foot. He needed to keep it that way. He needed to get in its space and stop it from taking the offensive. A loud explosion sounded out a few moments later. The blast of heat and magic sent a wave of fire several meters in all directions, even as it caused the gargoyle to snarl and back off a few more steps. Its skin now singed and partially burned in places. Grinning at this, Azoth lunged forward again, his movements quick and efficient as he lashed out with his new sword. The blade sang through the air as he lashed out with one hand, in quick, sharp slashes and thrusts. Already he had landed a half-dozen hits, his blade scoring the creature's rock-hard hide, cutting maybe an inch deep at most, but no more than that. The creature's hide was far more durable than he had thought. Scowling at this realization, Azoth quickly pulled back as the monster suddenly seized the advantage now, another bellow erupting from its maw as it rushed him and forced him to block and deflect several wild slashes from the monster's claws and barbed tail with the flat of his sword. Skipping back a few steps as he fended off the monster, Azoth raised his free hand again and unleashed a blast of concentrated frost at the gargoyle this time. A shell of frost rapidly formed over the creature's front side, even as he darted in again and continued to harry it with his sword, his teeth still bared, as his sword clipped into its side, once again cutting an inch or two deep, but not much more. Letting out another roar, the gargoyle twisted around and lashed out at him with its barbed tail. Dodging back again, a scowl spread across his face now as he continued to dance around it, needling it with blasts of magic and his sword. This was a far cry from his usual style of fighting. If he had had Dawnbreaker or Wuthrad, this fight would have probably already been over. A single slash from Dawnbreaker would have set the beast alight. Blow from Wuthrad, meanwhile, would probably have hewn it in 2. Still, he didn't have his enchanted weapons, but instead just a normal sword that was barely hurting the monster. More than that, though, his frost also didn't seem to be hindering it that much either. His weaker spells, which had been so effective on the first 10 or so levels, didn't seem to be having as much of an effect on this stronger monster. It was concerning. Growling internally at this, he switched up spells again, and instead of using frost, he instead unleashed another fireball. An explosion once more sounded off as fire consumed the gargoyle's form, the force of the concussive blast knocking it back a few steps, even as more fire lapped out over the already scorched square. Rushing in again after this, Azoth lashed out with his sword, his eyes narrowed as he ran through the forms Vilkas had smacked into his head back when he had first started fighting and questing with the companions, his blade slashing from high to low as he built up his momentum, the word practically singing as it swung through the air, biting deeper and deeper into the creature's hide with each strike. With another roar, the now burned and injured gargoyle tried to fight him off. He could see that there were now several long slashes and gashes in its hide. Furthermore, in places he also could see burnt reddish muscle had replaced its previously resistant hide, a clear sign that his spells had at least done something. Angling his sword, Azoth deflected the most recent of the gargoyle's slashes, his eyes still narrowed as he advanced on the once again retreating beast, even as it let out another snarl, and turned and whipped its spiked tail at him. Seeing the tail, Azoth shifted his sword again, moving it to intercept the tail with the edge of the blade. With a shriek of pain and anger exploding forth from the beast in response, even as the gray-skinned creature fell back again, its bestial face twisting in anger and anguish as it rapidly withdrew its suddenly much shorter tail. Grinning at this, Azoth continued forward, not letting up as he once again seized the advantage and lashed out a few more times with his blade. The sound of steel clashing with stone reverberated around the square as his sword met the monster's claws, and he managed to land several more slashes on the creature's arms and torso. Dark red blood was now splattering onto the floor of the square, the almost blackish liquid mixing in with the spilt blood of the civilians and adventurers this beast had already killed. He had it on its last legs. The creature was covered in wounds and burns. It was all but done. Azoth meanwhile didn't have a mark on him, save for a few spots of the creature's blood on his shirt. Cosmetic damage at worst. Locking eyes with the snarling monster, Azoth could only assume that the beast had worked this out too. After all, it had stopped retreating, with it instead standing its ground now. Its massive 10-foot-plus frame looming over him as it spread its giant tattered wings. He had made sure to disable them first and let loose another roar. Only this time, instead of just sound, fire also erupted from its maw. A large stream of it that tore through the air toward him. Shit, Azoth muttered, raising his other hand now as he called upon his steady ward spell. With a rush of heat and flame, the gout of fire hit him and exploded around him, with the fire rapidly eating away at his hastily constructed ward as it continued to swirl around him for a few seconds before it stopped. Brushing some soot off of his now partially burned shirt, Azoth's expression turned flinty as he looked up at the injured gargoyle, even as it huffed in some breath and prepared to unleash another blast of fire. This was my favorite shirt. Azoth scowled, looking down now as he examined some of the new holes and burns in his shirt. His ward had protected him for the most part, but not completely. A few stray embers had managed to burn their way through, and although they hadn't hurt him at all, his shirt was a lot less resistant than he was. If the monster even heard him, it didn't show it, as instead it drew in more breath for a moment, and lunged forward again as it prepared to unleash another blast of fire. With the injuries he had dealt to it, this was likely its last feasible form of attack, a slow and imprecise breath attack. It was like a shoddy replication of a dragon's fire breath. Scowling at this realization, Azoth drew in his own breath 3 familiar words of power, rising up within his mind as he locked onto them, and focused on the meaning behind each of the ancient words, the things they embodied. Yol to Ashul, he bellowed, a stream of molten fire exploding forth from his mouth as he did so, with reality itself, twisting as his words of power forced their will on it. With the massive blast of fire erupting froth from his mouth and rapidly expanding outward. With it, tearing across the intervening space between him and the gargoyle. His own golden fire rapidly consumed the gargoyle's paltry flames, even as it consumed the rest of the creature, burning away not just its body, but its magic stone too, reducing all before it to ash. Silence reigned in the square for a moment as all the remaining adventurers looked over at him, some of them wide-eyed as they took in the 30-meter cone of blackened glass now that spread out in front of Azoth, with that being all that remained of the monster, bodies and stones that his fire breath had consumed. And for a moment, all was calm as by this point the last monster in the square had been slain, or had been captured. But alas, this quiet calmness only lasted for a moment, before a chorus of new screams sounded out from one of the entrances to the square and 3 more adventurers spilled out onto the market square. A horde of orcs, battle boars, imps, a bear monster known as a bugbear, and a tiger monster known as a ligerfang all rushing in after the small group. With a looming, 4-meter-tall, orange-scaled, wingless dragon following along after them. To arms! One of the members of the Ganesha familia suddenly shouted, shattering the tension as he and a number of his fellows rushed in to aid the fleeing adventurers, and to Bring the fight to the newly arrived monsters. You heard him. Beckendorf bellowed next, his gore-soaked meat cleaver raised high and a wild smile on his face as he charged in next, the remaining 10 or so adventurers following his lead as they went to back up the others. Nodding at this, Azoth gripped his sword tighter and joined the charge, his lips curling upwards as he let loose a snarl and lashed out at an imp with his blade, easily decapitating it with a single swing. Ignoring the blood that spattered onto his already ruined shirt, Azoth forged on his hand, raised as he sent a spike of ice hurtling into the Ligerfang's flank as it leapt at a member of the Ganesha familiar, the force of the blow knocking it to the ground with a yowl and leaving it vulnerable as it was then massacred by 2 other Ganesha familiar members with axes. Pushing forward, Azoth barely blinked as he saw Beckendorf hamstring one of the pig-faced monsters they called orcs with his kitchen knife, before slamming his meat cleaver into and through its head as the 2-meter monsters collapsed to the ground. Instead he pressed on, more blood spattering across his pale face as he lashed out with his sword and disemboweled a bugbear, before finishing it off by shooting a firebolt into its mouth as it let loose a bellow of pain and rage, the blast of fire blowing its head to pieces. Breezing past the now-dead monster, Azoth this time unleashed a bolt of chain lightning from his hand, the smell of metallic ozone filling in the air as the bolt then blew apart an orc's head, and then bounced on to blast apart 3 imps and knock another orc onto its back, leaving it vulnerable as another adventurer darted in to finish it off with a sword thrust to the throat. These monsters, Azoth smiled, were a lot easier to kill than Gargoyle. Hell, they weren't even a challenge. Twirling his sword around, more blood showered the area as he cut through a half-dozen more monsters in seconds, his attention no longer on them as he instead focused on the small, fire-breathing dragon at the back of the horde of monsters. He had of course heard that there were dragons in the dungeon. Welf had mentioned them to him, as had Tsubaki, Leo, and Beckendorf when he had asked. There were apparently multiple species of dragons down there, from the weaker dragons like the one he faced now, the infant dragons, to the slightly stronger ones, like the green dragons, which were apparently the equivalent of a level 4 adventurer, or the Amphisbena on the 27th floor of the dungeon, a giant twin-headed dragon that apparently would give even a level 6 adventurer a challenge. Not only that, but apparently there were even more powerful species on the lowest floors, like the Cadmus, the strongest of the monsters on the 51st floor, or the Wyverns on the 56th floor, or Valgang dragons on the 58th floor. Either way, there were apparently dragons in the dungeon, and powerful ones at that, some of which he had been told were too strong to take on one-on-one. Azoth had to hold back a laugh at that thought. He was the ultimate dragon slayer. He didn't take that as a warning, he took it as a challenge. Locking eyes with the orange infant dragon, a sharp smile spread across Azoth's face as he flicked his sword to the side, flicking the blood and gore off of it, and then prepared to face down the orange dragon. Meeting his gaze, the infant dragon let loose another roar, before it then barreled towards him, a gout of fire exploding forth from its mouth as it ignored the monsters or adventurers in its path and continued its charge. Its fire is weak, Azoth muttered to himself as he didn't even try to block the stream of fire the dragon sent at him. After all, this is how dragons say hello. It barely even tickles. And that was true. He could feel the fire and could see it burning through his ruined shirt, but there was no pain, just a brief warmth that soon went away as the dragon stopped its assault and bulled forward, its maw open as it made to bite him or eat him. It was almost disappointing, he thought as he let out a sigh and sidestepped the dragon's lunge, his blade already whistling through the air as he then decapitated it with a single swing. The rest of the dragon crashing down around him now, even as its now headless corpse tumbled and fell to the ground with a loud wet thump. After fighting the gargoyle, and seeing how durable its flesh was to both blades and magic, he had been hopeful that the dragon would offer up another challenge. Sure, it was the weakest of the dragon species in the dungeon, but still, it was supposedly a dragon. He had at least thought that it would live up to its name, even a little bit. Kicking its head to the side, Azoth's frown remained in place as he stared down at its glazed over eyes and lolling tongue. This thing wasn't a dragon, it was just an overgrown salamander. Hey, heads up, Beckendorf shouted as he darted past him. His kitchen utensils now, discarded as he had instead replaced them with a bearded axe that he had salvaged from somewhere. Looking up at his words, Azoth immediately clocked onto what he meant. Down the street. That the monsters had come, he could see greenish blur darting back and forth, a sharp rapier-like sword in one hand, and manner of golden blonde hair streaming behind it as it cut down monster after monster with ease. Frowning at this, Azoth wiped his sword clean on his ruined shirt and sheathed it at his hip. Even as his fellows finished the last of the monsters, and the greenish blur came to a stop in front of where they were standing. It was Ace Wallenstein. Azoth recognized her vacant doll-like face and emotionless golden eyes straight away. The monsters are all dead, Ace said, her tone bland, which made it difficult to discern whether or not she was making a statement or asking a question. Deciding to take it as a question, Azoth nodded. Yes, as far as we can tell. Do you know what caused this, and how they got out? No, Ace said solemnly. They escaped from their enclosures near West Gate. A member of the Ganesha familia helpfully called out. We've no idea how, but we think it might have been sabotage. The guards were all dead, ripped to shreds by the monsters, and the gates to the cages had all been unlocked. Shit, sabotage. Beckendorf grunted as he came to join us. What kind of idiot would do a thing like that? Everless. One of the other adventurers muttered, with several more nodding or shaking their heads, as the 15 or so adventurers present quickly descended into mumbled conversation. Or you lot, another unfamiliar voice sounded out, the source of the voice being a fuzzy, black-haired adventurer with animal ears and a mane of curly black hair covering her head and the sides of her face. There are more monsters in the main square. Hearing that, Ace nodded, spared him a glance, and then leapt up off the ground and onto a nearby building, her entire body glowing green once more as wind rushed around her, before she then disappeared. Come on, let's go. Azoth muttered, a frown on his face as he grabbed Beckendorf's sleeve, and started to head off in the direction the animal girl had pointed. Right. Beckendorf nodded, quickly catching up to Azoth as the pair of them started to run, leaving the other adventurers behind to clean up. Hopefully we'll catch up with the others too. Azoth nodded at that. It had only been about 20 or so minutes, but he hadn't seen Tsubaki or the others, not since they had split up to get food and drinks. They'll be fine though. Everyone but Welf is at least level 2, and they'll all make sure to look after Welfie. Beckendorf said, seemingly more to assure himself than Azoth, as the two took a few narrow side paths and then emerged into the city's main square. What is that? Beckendorf shouted as the two of them came to a stop and took in the scene. In front of them, there were 3 strange, green plant-like monsters dominating the square, with multiple vine-like tendrils extending from the monsters and whipping around, driving off the adventurers around them as they lashed out at anyone and everyone that they could. Some kind of living plants. Azoth queried, following the monsters' threshing vines as they gripped onto a familiar dark-skinned Amazon, even as said Amazon's sister rushed in and started trying to punch the vine and free her sister. From the looks of it though, it seemed that the monster's hide was too strong to easily get through. They kind of reminded him of Spriggans, only less humanoid and more monstrous. Looks like the Loki familiar are already dealing with them. Beckendorf nodded, his gaze now on the familiar forms of Beat Loga and Aze as the two of them darted around the other monsters, landing strikes and blows on them before leaping away. Meanwhile the elf, Lefia, was back behind them chanting, her hands raised and several magical circles already forming around her. Doubt they really need our help really. 4 level 5s and a level 4 should do it. Putting to one side just how Beckendorf knew the levels of the 5 adventurers in front of them, Azoth instead began to stride forward. They might not need it, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't offer to help all the same. Yeah. Beckendorf nodded, catching up with him. I'm just saying, your sword and my axe, they won't do much good. Those plant things look tough. I mean just look, not even Wallenstein's sword can pierce them, and her blade is much better than our weapons. As he said this, Ais, as if to prove him wrong, leapt forward, once again surrounded by green wind, and slashed through one of the monster's vines. Azoth sent Beckendorf an amused look. Okay, but still, the point stands. We're not armed properly to deal with monsters that tough. Or at least I'm not. Beckendorf waved him away. That's fine, you stand back. I'll deal with them. Azoth nodded, clapping Beckendorf on the shoulder as he walked past him and sheathed his sword. Oh great, and now I feel bad. Beckendorf called after him. Don't, Azoth replied, before breaking into a run, with Beckendorf jogging along after him. Looking up, he could hear the ground start to rumble, even as the head of the monsters opened up, revealing a large brightly colored flower with many teeth. Its snake-like vines suddenly picked up their speed and ferocity as all three monsters continued to lash out at the surrounding adventurers. Did it bloom? Tyon asked suddenly, jumping off of one of the monsters and landing near to where Azoth and Beckendorf were now standing. It was a flower, not a snake. Her now free sister, Tiona, shouted back, before blinking in surprise as she clocked onto his presence. Oh hey, Azoth. I didn't see you there. You came to join the party. This isn't exactly a party, Tyon said sourly, as she looked down at her partly melted clothing. Her apparel, if possible, skimpier than it had been before. They have acid blood, juice, or whatever it is inside them. I'll keep that in mind. Azoth nodded, his attention straying across the scowling Amazon and her grinning sister before it moved to the nearby Lefia, who hadn't even noticed his presence as she continued her chanting. Hey, did you know that you're shirtless? Tiona asked suddenly. It's a good look on you. Frowning at her words, Azoth looked down and saw that she was indeed right. His shirt was little more than burnt scraps at this point, which meant that his scarred, heavily muscled, pale, white torso was now on full display. Seeing this, Azoth looked back up at Tiona and shrugged. It is what it is. I like your style. Tiona grinned. Can you two focus, please? Tyon snapped, her attention snapping to them for a moment, before she looked back to the ongoing battle. Both Beat and Aze looked like they were in trouble as the three plants continued to try and swat them. Yeah. So, can one or other of you protect Lefia whilst she's doing her magic thing, while the other comes with us and helps sort them out? Yeah. Tiona grinned cheerfully, slugging him on the arm as she did so, before without waiting for an answer, she leapt back into the fray. If you do fight them, be careful. They are tougher than they look, and they spew a potent acid that'll melt through your weapons, and maybe your flesh too, if you're not careful. Tyon added on with a nod, her eyes on the combat now as she too leapt back into the fight. Keep an eye out, Azoth said to his companion, looking back at the fight now too as he did so, which was fortunate as he was just in time to see Aze leap forward and sever one of the monster's heads off, killing it. I'm going to go help out. With that said, Azoth unsheathed his sword and threw it to Beckendorf. Won't you need this? Beckendorf asked, easily catching the sword by the hilt with his free hand. Not for what I'm intending to do. Azoth shook his head, turning back to the fight just as Lefia unleashed her spell, an icy blizzard erupting forth from her magic circles as she did so, and consuming the two remaining plant monsters. Ice rapidly coating the monsters, even as the other members of her familia leapt backwards to avoid being hit. Seeing this, Azoth nodded to himself and took a deep breath. Liz Slen Nus. What followed next was a freezing cold wave of power that swept over the two struggling, frost-covered plant monsters. The force of the wave dispersed the blizzard Lefia had created, even as it froze both of the monsters solid. With that done, Azoth then raised both hands and summoned a ball of crackling lightning in each hand, before then flinging his hands forward and releasing a pair of thunderbolts. A loud crack and then a boom sounding out, as the two bolts struck and shattered both of the statues, destroying the frozen monsters within. Lefia turned to look at him in shock at this, with the others too turning to look at him, even as he continued to scan the square for more enemies. It looked like most of the fighting was over now, which of course meant that it was now time to clean up and get to the bottom of just how the monsters escaped in the first place. Chapter end notes. So as I said, pretty actions heavy. The next chapter will deal with the aftermath, that end. I'll also start pushing the plot along, as I don't want it to feel too slow. Not much to say other than that. I hope you enjoyed the chapter, and if you have any comments, suggestions, questions, etc., feel free to PM me. I reply to those. Thanks a lot for reading and stay safe out there. Greed 720. Chapter notes. Chapter 13. Merry Christmas, everyone. Hope you all have a great day, and enjoy my Christmas offering. Sorry it has been so long between updates, the time has gotten away from me. What with everything going on, plus I started too many stories. That, and since I am making excuses, I also left it so long between updates that I forgot what I was going to write next. I had a vague outline, but that was all, and 5 lines was not nearly enough. Not when I hadn't written or thought about this story much in over half a year, so I left it, and focused on other things. Still I persevered, and after receiving dozens of PMs asking my when I am going to update, whether the story is dead, or whether they can adopt it, I decided to get back into the swing of things and actually write the next chapter. And just in time Christmas too. So yes, here we are, I hope you enjoy, and let's hope the next chapter doesn't take as long. Then again, I have been pondering an Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, or Lord of the Rings crossover. Wouldn't that be a lot of fun? Smiley face. Another thing while I am at it, is this. I am a part of a Discord group. There's tons of others there, plenty of writers, admittedly mainly PJO, but other stuff too. Feel free to pop along and say hi. I'm always happy to chat about the stuff I am writing. So if you fancy it, please do to join with this link. But anyway, here is chapter 13. Hope you enjoy. Please leave a review, etc. If you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to PM me, or if not, join my Discord. Disclaimer, I do not own the Elder Scrolls, Skyrim, or Danmachi. Last time. With that done, Azoth then raised both hands and summoned a ball of crackling lightning in each hand, before then flinging his hands forward and releasing a pair of thunderbolts. A loud crack and then a boom sounding out as the 2 bolts struck and shattered both of the statues, destroying the frozen monsters within. Lefia turned to look at him in shock at this, with the others too turning to look at him, even as he continued to scan the square for more enemies. It looked like most of the fighting was over now, which of course meant that it was now time to clean up and get to the bottom of just how the monsters escaped in the first place. See the end of the chapter for more. With Azoth. Notes. Azoth rolled his shoulders for a moment as he felt the cold air swirling around his bare-chested form. The wintry air was the last remnant of his shout. Remnants that were even now dispersing, like the frozen chunks of ice that still littered the plaza floor and being consumed by the hot, sticky atmosphere that usually pervaded Rio. It was refreshing in a way. Where the cold might bother others, especially those not used to it, it had never bothered him. Instead, it had always soothed him. In fact, thinking back now, he couldn't remember the cold ever really bothering when he was growing up, just like it hadn't bothered the Nords he had grown up around. This in itself had been a boon when he had been younger, and growing up in the streets of Riften. The cold might not have been as bad in the Rift as it was up in Dawnstar or Winterhold, but it had still been brutal in winter. The cold had been such that the Argonians in the city had had to crowd into huts, huddling on top of one another around large fires in order to maintain their body temperatures, even as other foreigners had had to wrap up warm and smother their exposed extremities in animal fat, so as to protect themselves from frostbite and the biting cold winds that blew through the region. Winter was the greatest killer in Skyrim. Entire families had starved to death in their homes. Before now, trapped by the great snow drifts that swept the land. Others had frozen to death, the tears on their faces turning to ice as winter's cold talons ripped the vestiges of life from them. There was a reason why the locals of Skyrim were tough and hardy. It was so they could survive the worst of the season. It was also why they lived life so hard, rushing every facet of it, eking out as much pleasure as they possibly could out of every situation. Life in the North was hard and brutal. If the wars, bandits, and monsters didn't get you, then starvation, disease, and the cold probably would. Letting out a deep breath, Azoth looked around the plaza. Rio was very different to Skyrim. It was a warm, multicultural, happy place. Or at least it normally was. Right now, however, things were slightly tenser. The monsters that had previously run rampant through the streets were now dead, and now the rampage was over. The area was now filled with adventurers and normal citizens both, as people started cleaning up after the carnage the monsters caused. Those that had been injured during the fracas were currently being helped to safe zones, where loved ones could find them. In the more severe cases, the injured were being stretchered or carried away for healing. Already he could see healing points were being set up in and around the square for those who had been badly hurt in the rampage or in the crush of the escaping crowds. Those that had died in the attack, however, had simply been covered with cloth for the moment and left to the side for later identification. Looking around, Azoth felt a slight knot in his stomach as he saw how muted the atmosphere was. It was a far cry from the jubilant, celebratory feeling that had previously infested the city just half an hour earlier, as the citizens trawled the market stalls, gorged themselves on the festival food and ood and ahd at the Ganesha Familiar's monster show at the amphitheater. The difference was palpable. In a way, it almost hurt. He had never really, fully connected with a place before. When he had been in Riften, he had felt like an outsider. The Maish population there was only small to begin with, and those that did live there were very tribalistic. For the most part, they stuck with their own kind, and kept members of the others' races at arm's length. The Altma were stuffy by nature, or at least from his experience, and oftentimes they had refused to lower themselves to talk to someone like him, a white-haired street urchin that lacked their golden skin, hawkish features, and gilt pedigree. The Dunma, with their dusky grey skin and dark eyes, merely ignored him. The collective trauma of their people, especially with the way the Nords tended to treat them, had made them an insular folk by nature. If you were not one of them, then you were not trustworthy, and thus they were not interested. There were expectations to this, of course, but for the most part, the majority of the Dunma he had met in Skyrim fell into this category. The Orizima and Bosma were also very tribal. There were not many that lived in or around Riften, but those that did only dealt with their own kind, and only left the comfort of their own circles when they had to deal with an outsider. It didn't help that the Bosma hated urban areas by nature, and thus stuck to living in the forests and away from the domesticated city folk. The Orizima, meanwhile, had their own strongholds, and rarely ventured forth from those unless they were specifically looking for something. As a snow elf, not that he had known what he was at the time, he had been alone. He had been an outcast. His distinctly Mirish features, his angular face, delicate features, and long pointed ears, had made him stand out from the humans that infested Riften. The Nords that populated Riften were suspicious and uncomfortable around him. The Bretons and Imperials, meanwhile, the few that there were just not interested in investing time and money into some young guttersnipe that would probably die young, especially when the members of those races only came to Riften to barter and make money, and very rarely to live and settle down. His lack of recognizable Maish features, however, ironically made his fellow elves just as suspicious. His skin was so pale that in winter it was almost translucent, his hair was snow white, and his eyes a gleaming violet. Aside from the ears and the delicate features, he didn't resemble any of the other Mer races. He was the odd one out, and always had been, even after he had joined up with the Thieves' Guild, first as a lowly pickpocket and lookout, and later as a housebreaker. He hadn't really fit in very well. The Thieves' Guild had been a rough place. The weak tended to be bullied and pushed around by the strong, and as a child he had been weak. When it came to paying dues, he often found himself being beaten up and having his money stolen before he had his chances to cough up, which of course meant he got a good hiding, and was forced deeper in debt to the guild, a debt that could only be paid off by taking on the grunt work for more dangerous jobs. Not that he had been the only child the guild recruited. No, orphans and runaways were the guild's bread and butter. It was from those groups that they recruited most of their members, children that they then raised and indoctrinated into becoming full-fledged foot soldiers. And it was these children that had, more often than not, been the ones roughing him up and robbing him. Unfortunately, the only way for the weak to become strong was through making friends with the strong, and then hiding in their shadow until you were strong enough to stand on your own 2 feet, which, although a good idea in theory, didn't work when you were an outcast, even within a guild of outcasts. Then again, the same could be said for the other places in Skyrim he had visited once he had got older and had fled Riften to find his fortune elsewhere. Solitude, Markarth, Windhelm, Dawnstar, Morthal, Whiterun, Forkreath, Winterhold, none of these places had felt like home, even after he was reborn as the Dragonborn and became one of the strongest of the strong. No, not a single one of them had felt like home, not even after he had bought property in several of the cities, a place to call his own, and had made a name for himself, and even got himself a few titles. Instead, he had always felt like an outsider, like a stranger who just didn't belong. Often, he had only felt accepted for what he could do for other people, and what he could offer, and not for who he was as a person. Here in Ororio, although he had only been here a month, it felt different. These people didn't know what he was, or who he was. nor did they seem to care. Instead, they saw him for who he was and what he had built himself up to be. There were so many races in the city that he didn't even stand out either. Instead, he was a face in a crowd, judged on who he was and not what he was. Sure, it could be argued that his high level had something to do with his acceptance. But he didn't think so. Hephaestus and her familia had accepted him with open arms, even before his level had become known. On top of that, he hadn't sensed that any of the familia wanted to use him or were only cozying up to him because it benefited themselves, and he had good senses for that kind of duplicity. Instead, they felt genuine. They were all just generally decent people, people with similar interests to his own. When they dealt with him as an equal. It was strange in a way, but he liked it. He had spent his entire life in Skyrim, and yet it had never felt like home. There had always been an underlying sense of danger and conflict in the country, and an undercurrent of tension. A month here, though, in this alien and unfamiliar city, and he felt comfortable and relaxed. This place felt more like home than any other place he had been before. More so than even Jorvaska, the home of the companions, and the only other place he had felt truly accepted. Shaking his head at that thought, Azoth tore his thoughts out of his past and focused back on the here and now. There was work to be done, injured to be transported, and areas to secure. From what he had heard, the goddess Freya had already donated a few hundred doses of healing potion to help the wounded. Not long after Freya's offer, some of the other gods, like Ishtar and Loki, had done the same. Despite their generous offers, however, there were still hundreds of wounded all across the city. Those with minor wounds were being bandaged and treated the old-fashioned way. The more seriously injured were being looked after by healers and given potions. Nodding his head as he took in the situation, Azoth decided on his next course of action. The Ganesha familia had already secured the area the monsters had escaped from and were already checking through the lists of what had escaped. While they had been doing that, and others had been helping the injured and dying, he had been searching the area for remaining monsters with the Loki familia and Beckendorf. Now that was done, however, and the area had been secured, he was back in the main plaza. And it was time for him to help in a different way. With that thought in mind, he started to head towards the nearest healing station. "Hey Azoth, where are you headed?" Beckendorf called as he saw him break off from the group. Looking back, he could see a grim look on Beckendorf's face as he naturally started to follow his lead. "I'm going to help," Azoth replied, glancing back at the dark-skinned teen, his eyes flicking down to the borrowed sword and the stolen cleaver he now had thrust through his belt, before shifting back to his face. "Oh, and do you know much about healing?" Beat asked petulantly from behind him. Beat, along with Aze and Tiona, had also joined them on their search for all the werewolves. Posturing he was a strong fighter and a highly competent tracker, add in his heightened senses that were probably better than his own, and he was the ideal person to have along on a search and destroy mission. It was just a shame about his personality. Aze and Tiona had also tagged along, though for different reasons. Aze, he suspected, had joined them as an excuse to escape the clutches of her overly affectionate god, Loki. Tiona, meanwhile, he assumed, had just come along to stave off her own boredom, and because she was still wanting to fight. "I know some things," Azoth replied mildly, glancing behind as he walked, only for him to notice that the other three were following along behind him. Hey, so now you are a healer too, on top of being a pro brawler, smith and mage. Tell me, is there anything you can't do?" Tiona rolled her eyes, her arms crossed in front of her, as she then gave him an expectant look. "Bullshit level 6s, Beckendorf added. "Nah, this doesn't have anything to do with his level. All the other level 6s I know have become specialized. I'm pretty sure you have to get to that level. Sure, they can do other things, but mainly they just specialize in what they are good at. But the amount you can do, it just doesn't make sense. Just what kind of skills do you have?" Beat grumbled, his brow furrowed as he inspected Azoth suspiciously. "You're not supposed to just ask someone that. It's a little personal, you know," Tiona shot back, elbowing the werewolf in the ribs. "Does it really matter? Fact is, he is our familiar's ace, and also, kind of awkwardly, our newest member." Beckendorf laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of his head. "Which means he was already this strong before he even came to Orario." Beat added, his lupine eyes still boring into the back of Azoth's head. It can happen. I knew a pair of level 5s who were born and grew up outside of Ororio. And besides, Tyon and I were both level 3 when we got here. Tiona spoke up, a slight frown on her face now as she gave him a speculative look. Yeah, and how did you get that strong outside of the dungeon? Beat asked, his grey eyes now on Tiona. That's none of your business. Tiona replied bluntly, her normally excitable and vibrant eyes growing colder as she turned to Beat and coolly met his gaze. Ignoring the byplay, Azoth continued his journey to the nearest healing point, which just so happened to be in the center of the plaza the last of the monsters had been killed in, by him. Stepping over the last few melting blocks of ice, Azoth ignored the speculative looks he was receiving from some of those present, including the goddess Loki and several of her familiar members. Instead, he continued over to where the injured had been laid out, some of them moaning and groaning as people tended to them, while others just lay quietly, already unconscious or asleep. Looking around, he could see that there were a lot of injured people, probably nearly 50 in this part of the city alone, and these were just the ones that had been too injured to move, or to leave under their own power. The number didn't include the dozens of prone shroud-covered bodies he had already walked past, those that were not lucky enough to survive the escaped monsters' rampage. Whoever released those monsters, or allowed them to escape, they had a lot to answer for. Sighing at the sight of so much pointless death and pain, Azoth entered the nearest triage and approached the closest wounded person he could see. He wanted to help. Looking down at the wounded person, he quickly saw that it was a young, brown-haired child, or maybe a Paolum. He wasn't entirely sure. Either way, whatever she was badly injured. Looking down at her, he could see that she had curled up on herself in pain. From just a glance, he could see her body quivering, even beneath the blood-soaked white coat she was wearing. She was also, he noted, clutching a hastily wrapped arm to her chest. Running a hand through his messy white hair, Azoth knelt down at her side. "Is it just your arm that you hurt?" he asked softly, reaching out as he spoke and gently placing his hand on the small girl's shoulder. In response, she flinched. Wincing at the response, Azoth withdrew his hand. He'd never been good with children, not even when he had been a child. Call it a general disassociation with kids, something which had been born from his own isolation during his upbringing, or him just being incredibly awkward. But he never knew how to talk to them, or what to say. They weren't like adults that he could laugh and joke with, his standard fallback when he was feeling awkward. The humor would likely both be inappropriate and pass over their heads unnoticed. Instead, they were undeveloped, highly emotional, and incredibly fragile. "Look," Azoth began again, his voice still soft as he pondered over what to say next. "My name is Azoth, and I'm here to help. Now, I have magic, and can use it to heal you if you want. I could probably even fix that arm up for you too, if you'll let me." Shifting about at his words, he caught a glimpse of the girl's nervous, suspicious hazel eyes, and some curly brown hair as she glanced at him from beneath her white hood. "So, what's your name?" Azoth tried again, with forced patience. There were lots of other people around that needed help, and he didn't want to just wait around trying to convince some brat to let him heal her. At the same time, he couldn't just up and ditch this girl, just because she was being difficult. He might not be a healer by nature, but he liked to think of himself as a good person at least. "Why?" the girl asked. "Why what?" Azoth replied nonplussed. It was not the answer he was expecting. "Why are you helping me?" she continued, her pain seemingly forgotten for a moment as she instead questioned his motives of all things. "Because I'm not a dick," Azoth said bluntly, making the girl jump slightly, even as she once again looked around at him, her curiosity now warring with the suspicion and pain in her gaze. "I have the power to help you, so why wouldn't I do it? I'm not a selfish prick, if it costs me nothing but some time to help others. Why wouldn't I?" "You're an adventurer," the girl stated, as if that simple statement was enough of an explanation. "I'm a blacksmith first." Azoth shot her down, his lip quirking upwards in amusement. Technically speaking, he was a thief first, and then a bandit, and finally a warrior and blacksmith third, with a little bit of barely competent mage thrown in at the end. But when it came down to it, forging and creating new things interested him far more than monster hunting. It paid better too. Unfortunately, Due to the whole Dragonborn deal, he didn't have much of a choice in the matter. It was difficult to avoid the call to action and focus on being an artificer when your very soul itself lusted for battle. On top of which, exploring and adventuring came with the added bonus of loot, including new weapons he could examine and new materials he could test out and experiment with. Fortunately, I've also picked up some magic over the years, including 2 handy little healing spells. Azoth continued with a smile. Turning over, the girl shifted her body, so she was now facing him, her suspicious eyes still locked onto his own. You're an elf. Well, duh, what gave it away? Was it the ears? Azoth replied dryly. Oddly enough, in this world he didn't stand out at all. Where in Skyrim, he was always the odd mer out. Here he just looked like an albino elf, something which people barely paid attention to. And you're either a midget, a child, or a pal-lum. The girl scowled in response, her pain momentarily forgotten. I'm going to guess pal-lum then. Azoth smirked, before with a grin he held out his hand. So, like I said before, the name's Azoth. What's your name, short stuff? Despite what you say, you are still kind of a dick. The girl replied, before wincing and clutching her wrapped-up arm closer to her chest. That's probably true. Now how about you stop being stubborn and let me help you out? Azoth said, rolling his eyes. What'll it cost? The girl shot back. Just your name will do, Azoth replied, once again rolling his eyes. Narrowing her eyes, the girl glared at him for a moment, before finally, grudgingly, she offered him her arm. It's Lily, and I'm watching you. Good to know, Azoth said, before taking her arm carefully in his hands and gently unwrapping it. Now, let's see what we're dealing with. Broken, a monster hit a building, the falling stone hit me. The girl grunted, wincing and almost withdrawing her arm as he continued to take off the makeshift bandage which, as he unwrapped it, he discovered to be a scarf. Shit happens, at least you're not dead, Azoth said bluntly, eyeing the girl's arm. It was definitely broken, and badly at that. It looked to be broken in at least 2 places. On top of that, her flesh was red and swollen around the breaks, and the surrounding flesh was almost yellow, a sure sign of bruising. The arm was essentially a mangled mess. He had seen an injury like it before, only that time it had been caused by a mammoth stepping on a companion's arm. Without magic or very skilled medical attention, it would heal crooked and leave the girl crippled for the rest of her life. That's comforting, Lily said sourly. Azoth hummed in response. The girl had attitude. A part of him liked that though, as it meant she had personality. Holding back a snarky response of his own, he narrowed his eyes in concentration as he kept the girl's arm steady with one hand, whilst he used his other to cast Healing Hand. Keeping his mind focused and drawing on his magicka, he watched as his right hand took on a shining golden glow, with wisps of golden magic flowing off it like water, even as he placed his hand onto the girl's injured arm and willed it to heal. This spell was one of the only 2 healing spells that he knew. The first was focused on healing himself. It was good for remedying small injuries. This one, however, he had learned, as it allowed him to heal others. It was a useful spell to have for when he dragged other people off on his hair-brained adventures. The girl muttered, her eyes widening as she saw her arm starting to glow, the bruising rapidly receding, even as her bones painlessly cracked back into place and melded together. Fortunately, it was not an expensive spell to cast magicka-wise. It also didn't need much in the way of guidance or medical or anatomical knowledge. A person's body knew what it should look like. All the spell did was supercharge the body's natural healing process by using his magicka as opposed to the person's own vitality and energy. It also had a handy side effect built into it by its creator, and those that improved on it later, of numbing the area of the body it affected. Unfortunately, it was also limited in just what it could do. It could mean minor to moderate wounds, but wasn't as effective on more grievous and gruesome injuries. And done, Azoth said with a smile, withdrawing his hand 30 seconds or so later. The girl's arm was now completely healed, and there wasn't as much as a mark on her. The girl tried to speak, sitting up fully now, her brow furrowing as she gazed at her now uninjured arm, before looking up at him, a befuddled expression on her face. Don't worry about it, just try to avoid collapsing buildings next time. Azoth grinned, ruffling her shoulder-length, curly brown hair. As he did so, her hood had fallen down after. She sat up, much to her displeasure. "See you around, Lily." The girl initially just huffed in response. However, as he turned around, he did just about hear a meek, muttered, "Thank you," as he headed on to the next patient. Smiling at that, Azoth shook his head. She might have an attitude and a bit of a chip on her shoulder, but the Paolum had a good heart, that or she at least had good manners. As he started to move on to the next patient, however, he sensed someone watching him closely and looked around, surveying his surroundings. Loki was watching him. Previously, when they had first re-entered the plaza, he had seen her latch onto the returning A's like a limpet. Now, however, she had released A's, allowing the doll-like blonde to edge away and join her captain, the short blonde Paolum, and the other busty Amazon sister, while Loki now just studied him closely. Similarly, the captain of the Loki familia, Finn, was watching him too, even as the remaining members of their familia, including Beat and Tiona, helped to return the plaza back to some semblance of order by using their enhanced strength to clear the remaining rubble and monster corpses. Beckendorf, meanwhile, stuck by him, hovering over his shoulder as he moved on to the next patient, a kind-faced, animal person, possible a dog person, with a broken leg. As did the elf girl, Lefia, who he also noticed had moved to follow him. Her face was still pale, and her expression was fatigued, but she was still standing, and was apparently quite content to watch him work while she regained her energy. Looking over the rest of the plaza, he could see that Riveria had also started healing the injured, as had a small number of other adventurers, those capable of using healing magic. "How's it going?" Azoth asked the younger elf, his gaze returning to Lefia, even as he gave her a warm smile. He didn't know the girl well, but she seemed sweet. "Fine, a bit tired, but fine," Lefia replied, her blue eyes fixed on him. "What about you? That was an impressive bit of magic you did earlier with the ice. It was more powerful than anything I was able to do." "It wasn't magic," Azoth said shortly, finishing off his healing of the animal person, before moving on to the next patient, pausing only to make small talk with his new patient, before he continued speaking to Lefia. "It was what would you call it, a unique skill, I suppose." "That was a skill?" Lefia asked quietly. "It would explain why there was no aria," Charles added with a shrug, referencing the chant most magic users here seem to use. "I'm guessing it's the same thing with your healing. That's a pretty handy skill. Shouldn't you be helping the others?" Azoth asked dryly, his attention shifting to Charles as he finished sealing a bloody thigh wound and ruffled the hair of a small child. This one he knew was definitely a child, as he could see the boy's grateful mother cradling him. "No need. Pretty much everything has been done by now." Charles shrugged, "Though I should probably find the others. Not that I'm all that worried. Lisbeth and Leo are both level 2, Erhard is level 3, and Tsubaki is a level 5. Between the three of them they should have been able to look after Welf and each other. But with things as they are, and this being caused by sabotage, well, I don't know. They'll turn up, as you say they are tough." Azoth shrugged, moving on to the next wounded person. "How are you doing anyway, Lefia?" "Like I said before, tired," Lefia replied quietly, a glum expression on her face as she looked around at the plaza. "Fighting those plant monsters took a lot out of me, and then I was healing, but the Luna Aldis spell I was using is a taxing one, and now I'm just tired, and almost out of mind." "You've had a long day," Azoth said. He wasn't sure what else to say. There was obviously something bothering the girl, but he didn't know her well enough to guess what it was. "I'm sure there are a lot of people grateful to you for what you did. If you hadn't stepped up and fought those monsters, then who knows what would have happened." "That's easy coming from you," Lefia sighed tiredly, rubbing at her eyes. "I was struggling to keep them down, and then you just come out and destroy them in an instant. What kind of skill even does that?" "A very powerful one, that's what." Loki answered for him, her voice making Lefia jump, and Beckendorf swear as she appeared between the two of them, her fox-like features twisting into an expression of amused curiosity as she looked down at him. "Just who are you?" "Azoth, a member of Hephaestus's familia." Azoth replied bluntly, his gaze on Loki. He still didn't fully understand or trust these gods. Hephaestus was the one he knew best, and she seemed decent enough. Hestia and Loki were the only other ones he had had marginal contact with, and seemed all right. Despite that, however, he still found them a mystery. On the outside, they appeared human, and yet they could bless mortals within human levels of power. They were a contradiction. The Daedra and Aedra could do the same, but they never willingly appeared weak. The Aedra remained separate from the mortal plane and only ever gave their blessings to those that worshipped at their altars. The Daedra occasionally took human form to mess with mortals, but it was little more than an illusion, or them temporarily possessing the body of a mortal. They would never deliberately weaken themselves by taking on a mortal form, even to mess with mortals. These gods, however, had given up their place in heaven, had sealed away the vast majority of their power, and had taken on mortal forms by choice. They were nothing like the divine beings he knew, and a former member of the, what was your old goddess's name again? Meridia. The Meridia familiar. Loki pressed on, apparently oblivious to her thoughts. Funny, I've asked around, and no one has ever heard of her before. Yes, her name was Meridia, Azoth said shortly, his gaze on the red-haired goddess for a moment, before dismissing her and her insinuation, as he instead turned back to Lefia. And, as for what skill it is, well, it is a unique one, and that's all I can really say. A person's status is private, Charles added, his gaze on Loki. It's between them and their god. Hey now, no need to be all suspicious, I wasn't prying. Loki quickly replied, raising her hands in a sign of her innocence. I just came over to see how little Lefia was doing, and caught the trail end of your conversation. Azoth hummed, his gaze on Loki. That, and after the help you gave my kiddos, I was going to extend you and the rest of your familiar an invitation to join me and my kids for a feast at the Twilight Manor. Loki pressed on, a vulpine smile spreading across her face. Lady Loki? Lefia asked, her eyes widened in surprise. Beckendorf blinked and looked uncertain. Well, why not? Our familiars are allies, and will be going on a little jaunt in the dungeon together soon. Why not have a night to celebrate? Loki continued enthusiastically. I'll pass on the invitation to Hephaestus, so don't worry about telling her yourself. She pressed on, overriding anything he or Beckendorf could say, as she instead threw her arm around Lefia's arrow shoulders and started to guide her away. We can make a whole evening of it. Azoth and Beckendorf shared a look at that, even as they saw the duo leaving. Or rather saw Loki bouncing away, her arm still resolutely around Lefia's narrow shoulders, the elf girl's long brown hair, still tied back in a ponytail, waving from side to side as her goddess jostled. She's an odd one, isn't she? Charles muttered. Suspicious, more like, Azoth corrected. She's harmless. Reveria clarified, her melodic voice making the pair of them jump and turn around. What the hell? Charles shouted, nearly leaping out of his skin. 9 hells, actually. Riviera replied with a slight smile. Catching the reference to her well-known moniker, Azoth rolled his eyes. He hadn't thought the prim and proper elf was capable of making a joke. Have you finished healing? Azoth asked, deciding not to comment. I have healed all that need it. Riveria nodded, brushing a lock of long green hair over her shoulder as she looked down at Azoth and offered him a shirt. And I've brought you a spare shirt. Thanks, Azoth said, taking the offered shirt uncertainly. You're currently half naked, and it is distracting. Riveria said, answering his unasked question. Is that distracting in a good way or bad way? Azoth asked with a grin. From beside him, he could hear Beckendorf whistle and mutter, the ball's on you. Riveria gave him a flat look in response, even as he pulled the simple woolen shirt over his head. It was a perfect fit. And like I was saying before, Loki is harmless. A prankster and mischief maker, yes, but otherwise she is harmless and well-meaning. She is merely curious, we all are. You are an anomaly, Azoth. A high-level adventurer doesn't just appear out of nowhere, yet here you are. And not only are you high-level, you also have an impressive set of abilities, skills, and magic. You're a mystery, and Loki hates those. That's no doubt why she is inviting you to the Twilight Manor. Subtly is not her strong point, nor does she know when to give up. I have no doubt that she will dog you until she finds out what she wants. Riveria said, her green eyes surveying him calmly. Then she'll be disappointed. My secrets are my own, and not something I will just give up, and certainly not to assuage a curious goddess. Azoth said bluntly. Reveria smiled mildly. I will warn you now, she is tenacious. Well, fortunately, I'm stubborn. Azoth shot back. Her smile widened at his answer. Then I look forward to seeing you at the Twilight Manor. Soon, it should be an entertaining evening. With that said, she gave him another smile, a nod, and then bade him farewell. What is it with elves and being weird? Charles muttered to him. Azoth gave him a flat look in response, before with a sigh he looked around at the rest of the plaza and patted Beckendorf on the shoulder. I'm not sure what else we can do here, let's go. Catch up with the others. Right, Beckendorf nodded. And then we should probably get back to the Familiar and talk. To Hephaestus, she'll probably want some warning before Loki ambushes her. Chapter end notes. So what do you think? A bit of a chilled chapter after the action of the last chapter. No, but hopefully you still like it. Not much to say other than that. This was a difficult chapter to write as I had to juggle around a lot of characters. That said, I think I hit all the notes. This was more of a character development chapter, with minor setup, as you might expect. The next chapter will be a bit more meaty. There will be more conversation and interactions, more exploration of the Loki and Hephaestus familiars, and then we've got a dungeon dive, some more smithing, and even a little interaction with the Bell and his little group. Plenty to look forward to. Also, before people ask, the pairing is still undecided. I have ideas, but nothing set in stone. I'm going to let the story develop naturally and decide what makes sense. I've found I prefer it that way as opposed to contorting and twisting the story so it includes the pairing I want. That said, I hope people did enjoy the story and continue to read. Please leave a review, comment, etc. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to PM me. I'm usually good at answering them. Also, I am on a Discord with a load of other writers, so if you fancy popping over to ask questions or offer suggestions about this story, or any of my other ones, or to find new authors you might not have come across yet, please feel free to use the link in my bio or the link at the top of the page. Thanks for reading, and I'll see you next year. Greed 720. P.S. If you like this, please check out my brand new Elder Scrolls: A Lord of the Rings crossover. The next part is on its way, so unless you want to be that one person who hears about it last, like and subscribe now to stay ahead of the game. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. It's about to get epic. Thanks for listening. Catch you in the next chapter.